Welcome, weary traveler, to the shadowed forests of Gravity Falls, Oregon, where the line between reality and nightmare grows thin as morning mist. Tonight, we delve into the darkest corners of this seemingly quaint tourist town, exploring theories that chill the soul and mysteries that have haunted the Pacific Northwest for centuries. This is not a tale of simple summer adventures, but of ancient evils, cosmic horrors, and the terrible price of curiosity. So settle in, close your eyes when ready, and let us walk together through the pine-scented darkness, where nothing is quite what it seems, and every shadow holds secrets that perhaps should remain buried. Long before the first European boot touched the moss-covered earth of what would become Gravity Falls, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest understood that this valley was different from all others. Their oral traditions, passed down through countless generations around sacred fires, spoke in hushed tones of a place where the world grew thin, where the barriers that normally separated the realm of the living from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension had been worn away by forces older than human memory. The Maidu tribes, who wandered these forests in the long seasons before the arrival of pale-skinned strangers, had a name for this valley that has been lost to time, but its meaning lingers like smoke in the evening air, the place where earth bleeds dreams. They understood, with the wisdom that comes from living close to the natural world for thousands of years, that some locations on our planet serve as wounds in the fabric of reality itself, places where the normal laws of physics and causality become suggestions rather than absolute truths. According to their most sacred and carefully guarded stories, the valley had been cursed in the time before time, when the world was young and the gods walked among mortals without concealment or shame. A great catastrophe had befallen this place, they said, a tragedy so profound that it had left permanent scars, not just on the physical landscape, but on the very essence of reality that flowed beneath the surface of all things. The earth itself remembered this ancient trauma, and in its pain it called out across the dimensional barriers to things that should never have been allowed to answer. The tribal shamans, those brave souls who served as intermediaries between the world of flesh and the realm of spirits, spoke of visions that came to them in this valley. Visions of impossible geometries, of colors that had no names, of entities whose very presence caused reality to reshape itself in ways that drove lesser minds to madness. They established elaborate rituals and taboos designed to keep their people safe from the valley's influence, complex ceremonies that were meant to appease the hungry darkness that dwelled beneath the surface of this cursed place. These wise men and women understood that the valley was not merely haunted but fundamentally corrupted at the quantum level, its atomic structure somehow altered by exposure to energies from dimensions where the basic constants of existence followed entirely different rules. They observed that certain types of stone found only in this region would sometimes phase in and out of visible reality, that water from particular springs would reflect images of places that existed nowhere on Earth, and that the aurora borealis could be seen dancing in the southern sky during the darkest nights of winter, defying every known law of natural philosophy. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the reports of what the shamans called the hungry earth areas within the valley, where the ground itself seemed to feed on life force, slowly draining the vitality from any living creature that remained too long in one place. Animals would wander into these zones and emerge days later as hollow shells of their former selves, their eyes empty and their movements mechanical, as if their souls had been partially devoured by something that existed just beneath the soil. The tribal elders established strict boundaries around the valley, marking them with carved stones that bore symbols designed to ward off the attention of the entities that called this place home. These markers were not mere superstition but sophisticated dimensional anchors, created through techniques that combined shamanic wisdom with an intuitive understanding of forces that modern science would not begin to comprehend until the development of quantum mechanics in the 20th century. For generations beyond counting, the indigenous peoples maintained their vigilant watch over this cursed valley, ensuring that no one entered its boundaries without proper spiritual preparation and protection. They understood that the valley's corruption was not static but growing, spreading outward like a cancer through the fabric of reality itself, and that only constant ritual maintenance could prevent it from consuming the entire region in supernatural darkness. When the first European explorers arrived in the Pacific Northwest in the early 18th century, the tribal leaders attempted to warn them away from the valley through gestures and drawings, but the language barrier proved insurmountable. The pale-skinned strangers, driven by dreams of wealth and territorial expansion, dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition and pushed deeper into the wilderness in search of fur-bearing animals and navigable waterways. The consequences of this cultural misunderstanding would prove catastrophic not just for the indigenous peoples, but for every subsequent generation that would call this region home. The Europeans, lacking any understanding of the valley's true nature or the delicate spiritual ecosystem that had been constructed to contain its malevolent influence, blundered through the carefully maintained protective barriers like children playing with forces beyond their comprehension. The first trading post established in the valley was built directly over what the shamans had identified as one of the most dangerous dimensional weak points, a location where the barrier between our reality and the nightmare dimensions was so thin that it could be measured in molecular layers rather than miles. The European traders, seeking to take advantage of the valley's natural defensive positions and abundant water supply, had unknowingly constructed their settlement at the epicenter of supernatural activity. Within months of the trading post's establishment, strange reports began to filter back to the colonial settlements along the coast. Trappers spoke of encounters with creatures that defied classification, beings that seemed to shift and change their fundamental nature, depending on the angle from which they were observed. Native guides, normally reliable and steady in their demeanor, would flee without explanation from certain areas of the valley, refusing to explain their terror in terms that European minds could understand. The geological surveys conducted by early explorers revealed anomalies that challenged every accepted theory about the formation of the American continent. Rock formations appeared to be simultaneously millions of years old and mere decades in age, their atomic structure showing signs of having been subjected to pressures and temperatures that should not have been possible given the region's known geological history. Core samples taken from the valley floor contained minerals that did not match any known elements in the periodic table, their crystalline structures following mathematical principles that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. But it was the magnetic readings that proved most disturbing to the few scientists brave enough to venture into the valley with their primitive instruments. Compass needles would spin wildly in certain locations, not pointing to magnetic north but toward coordinates that appeared to exist slightly outside of normal space-time. The aurora phenomena, observed by the indigenous shamans, intensified during periods of high supernatural activity, creating light displays that photographers of the era claimed showed images of landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth. As more European settlers pushed into the valley during the mid-1700s, the fabric of reality began to fray in ways that could no longer be ignored or rationalized through conventional means. Entire families would disappear without trace, leaving behind homesteads where all their possessions remained undisturbed, but the people themselves had simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. Search parties would discover clearings where the laws of perspective seemed to break down, where objects in the foreground appeared smaller than identical items in the background, where shadows fell upward rather than down. The indigenous peoples, watching this slow-motion catastrophe unfold from their new settlements in the surrounding hills, understood that their ancient warnings had gone unheeded and that the valley's curse was now spreading beyond any possibility of containment. Their shamans performed desperate rituals designed to reinforce the failing dimensional barriers, but these ceremonies required access to sacred sites that were now occupied by European settlements, and their effectiveness diminished with each passing season. By the time the first permanent town was established in the valley in the late 1700s, the supernatural contamination had reached critical mass. The very soil had become infused with energies from dimensions where reality followed different rules, where cause and effect operated according to principles that would have driven Aristotle to madness and made Newton burn his notebooks in despair. Trees grew in impossible spirals that hurt the eyes to follow, their bark-bearing patterns that seemed to move when observed peripherally. Animals were born with anatomical features that belonged to entirely different species, as if the valley's influence was causing reality to become confused about the basic categories that defined biological existence. The water table itself had become contaminated with traces of matter from alternate realities, creating springs and wells that produced liquid that was technically water, but which possessed properties that defied chemical analysis. Settlers who drank from these sources reported vivid dreams that felt more real than waking life. Dreams of vast libraries filled with books written in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues, of machines that could fold space and time like origami paper, of entities whose thoughts were so alien that merely attempting to comprehend them caused permanent psychological damage. Yet despite all these warning signs, despite the mounting evidence that something fundamentally wrong was occurring in this remote valley, the European settlers continued to arrive, drawn by rumors of abundant natural resources and fertile soil. Each new family that established a homestead in the valley added to the cumulative weight of human consciousness pressing against the already weakened dimensional barriers, accelerating the rate at which reality itself began to break down. The indigenous peoples, forced to watch from a distance as their ancestral warnings proved prophetic in the most terrible ways imaginable, began to speak of the valley in new terms. No longer was it simply the place where earth bleeds dreams, but something far more ominous, the wound that will not heal, the valley where tomorrow dies, and most chilling of all, the place where God learns to forget. These new names reflected their growing understanding that the valley's corruption was not a static condition but an active process, a spiritual infection that was spreading through the collective unconscious of everyone who spent significant time within its boundaries. The curse was not content to simply exist, it was actively working to expand its influence, using the dreams and fears of human settlers as fuel for its dimensional incursions. As the 18th century drew to its close, and the first stirrings of what would eventually become the United States began to reshape the political landscape of North America, the stage was set for an even greater catastrophe. The valley that had been carefully contained by indigenous wisdom for countless generations was about to fall into the hands of men who possessed neither the knowledge to understand its true nature nor the humility to respect forces beyond their comprehension. The curse that had slumbered beneath the earth for millennia was stirring, awakening to the taste of human ambition and the sweet corruption of civilized arrogance. Soon, very soon, it would find the perfect vessel for its malevolent intelligence, a man whose greed and ruthless determination would make him the ideal partner in the valley's long-planned expansion beyond the boundaries that had contained it. Since the dawn of human memory, the ancient curse was about to find its first willing servant, and through him, it would begin the work of transforming a simple trading settlement into something that would one day be known throughout the supernatural community by a name that would strike fear into the hearts of all who understood its true significance. Gravity Falls. Stanford Philbrick Pines was born into a world that had already marked him for tragedy, though the nature of that tragedy would not become apparent until decades later, when the full scope of his crimes against reality itself could finally be measured and catalogued by those few minds capable of comprehending such cosmic horror. From his earliest moments of consciousness, Ford carried within his developing psyche the seeds of an obsession that would eventually consume not only his own soul, but threaten the fundamental structure of existence across multiple dimensions. The extra finger that adorned each of his hands was not merely a genetic anomaly, as the medical professionals of his childhood had so confidently declared, but rather a physical manifestation of his deeper connection to forces that operated beyond the normal parameters of human understanding. This polydactyly, rare enough to occur in fewer than 1 in every 500 births, marked him as what certain occult traditions would have recognized as a bridge child, a being whose very anatomy suggested a fundamental incompatibility with the standard laws of physics and biology that govern normal human existence. In the working-class neighborhoods of Glass Shard Beach, New Jersey, where young Stanford spent his formative years surrounded by the industrial decay and economic desperation that characterized so much of mid-20th century America, his unusual hands made him an object of constant ridicule and social ostracization. The cruelty of children, unleashed without the tempering influence of adult wisdom or compassion, carved deep wounds in his developing sense of self-worth that would never properly heal, festering beneath the surface of his consciousness like infected spiritual wounds that grew more toxic with each passing year. His twin brother, Stanley, born moments after Ford but lacking any visible signs of genetic abnormality, served as a constant reminder of what normal human existence might have looked like. Where Stanley moved through the world with the unconscious confidence of someone whose body matched societal expectations, Ford learned to hide his hands in pockets, to avoid situations where his difference might be exposed, to construct elaborate psychological defenses against the shame that threatened to consume him from within. The academic environment provided Ford with his first taste of the validation that would become his most dangerous addiction. Teachers, impressed by his precocious intelligence and his ability to absorb and synthesize complex information at a rate that far exceeded his peers, began to single him out for special attention and advanced instruction. For a child who had spent his early years feeling fundamentally broken and rejected by the social world around him, this recognition felt like the first rays of sunlight penetrating a lifetime of shadow. But validation, like any powerful drug, requires ever-increasing doses to maintain its euphoric effects, and Ford's hunger for academic recognition quickly evolved into something far more consuming and ultimately destructive than mere scholarly ambition. He began to define his entire sense of self-worth through his intellectual achievements, constructing an identity so completely dependent on external validation that any perceived failure or criticism became a direct assault on his fundamental worthiness as a human being. His high school years were characterized by an increasingly manic pursuit of academic perfection, as if he could somehow compensate for the cosmic injustice of his genetic abnormality by proving himself intellectually superior to every other student in his class. He studied with an intensity that bordered on the pathological, often staying awake for days at a time as he worked to master subjects that his teachers had not even begun to explore, driven by a desperate need to demonstrate his value to a world that had spent his childhood teaching him that he was fundamentally defective. The scholarship to Backupsmore University, while certainly a significant academic achievement, was also his first taste of bitter disappointment in the realm where he had hoped to find his salvation. West Coast Tech, the prestigious institution where he had dreamed of studying alongside the brightest minds of his generation, had rejected his application, despite his near-perfect academic record. apparently put off by some intangible quality in his character that suggested instability or unreliability. This rejection, though he would never admit it to anyone, including himself, cut deeper than any childhood mockery had ever managed to penetrate. It confirmed his worst fears about himself, that despite all his efforts, despite all his sacrifice and obsessive dedication to intellectual achievement, he remained fundamentally flawed in ways that truly mattered to those whose opinions carried weight in the academic world. At Backupsmore, surrounded by students and faculty who were competent but hardly exceptional, Ford found himself simultaneously the most brilliant mind on campus and increasingly isolated from anything resembling normal human connection. His professors, recognizing his exceptional abilities, began to treat him more as a colleague than a student, loading him with research responsibilities that would have challenged graduate students while he was still technically an undergraduate. This premature elevation to quasi-professional status fed his growing sense of intellectual superiority, while simultaneously depriving him of the normal social experiences that might have taught him humility, empathy, and the kind of emotional intelligence that serves as a crucial counterbalance to pure analytical ability. He began to view his fellow students not as peers or potential friends, but as intellectual inferiors whose concerns and interests were beneath his notice. The isolation that had begun as an external imposition during his childhood gradually transformed into a conscious choice, as Ford convinced himself that his exceptional mind required exceptional solitude in order to function at its full potential. He began to actively avoid social situations, dismissing them as distractions from the important work of advancing human knowledge, never recognizing that his growing disconnection from normal human experience was slowly eroding his ability to maintain perspective on his own actions and motivations. His undergraduate thesis on abnormal phenomena in the Pacific Northwest should have been his first warning about the dangerous territory he was beginning to explore, but instead it became the foundation for an obsession that would eventually consume every other aspect of his existence. The academic establishment, predictably conservative in its approach to subjects that challenged conventional scientific wisdom, dismissed his research as the product of an overactive imagination rather than serious scholarship. This dismissal, rather than encouraging him to reconsider his methods or conclusions, only intensified his determination to prove that the phenomena he had documented were real and scientifically significant. He began to see himself as a lone voice of truth crying out in a wilderness of academic cowardice and intellectual mediocrity, a brilliant pioneer whose revolutionary discoveries were being suppressed by lesser minds who lacked the courage to confront uncomfortable realities. The grant funding that eventually allowed him to establish his research station in Gravity Falls came from sources that should have raised serious ethical questions about the nature of his work and the motivations of his financial backers. Government agencies with connections to psychological warfare programs, private foundations with ties to occult research groups, and wealthy individuals whose interest in the paranormal bordered on the pathological. These were not the kind of sponsors that legitimate scientific research typically attracted. But Ford, blinded by his desperate need for validation and consumed by his growing obsession with the supernatural phenomena he had identified in the Gravity Falls area, chose to ignore the warning signs and accept funding from anyone willing to support his work. He told himself that the source of the money was irrelevant, as long as it allowed him to pursue his research without interference, conveniently overlooking the obvious truth that his sponsors expected specific results in exchange for their investment. The first few years of his residency in Gravity Falls were characterized by discoveries that should have filled any rational researcher with profound unease rather than excitement. The dimensional anomalies he documented were not mere curiosities to be catalogued and studied. but active threats to the stability of reality itself, wounds in the fabric of existence that were slowly growing larger and more dangerous with each passing day. The creatures he encountered and catalogued in his journals were not simply unknown species awaiting scientific classification, but entities whose very existence suggested that the fundamental laws of biology and physics were more flexible than mainstream science was prepared to acknowledge. These beings operated according to principles that defied rational analysis, their anatomy and behavior patterns, indicating origins in dimensions where the basic constants of existence followed entirely different rules. Yet rather than approaching these discoveries with the caution and humility that their implications demanded, Ford threw himself into his research with ever-increasing enthusiasm and recklessness. Each new anomaly he documented, each creature he encountered, each dimensional rift he measured, became further proof of his own exceptional genius and the revolutionary importance of his work. The isolation of his forest laboratory, which he had initially seen as conducive to focused research, gradually transformed into something more sinister as his prolonged exposure to the valley's supernatural influences began to affect his psychological state in ways that he was too proud and too self-absorbed to recognize. The dimensional energies that permeated the area had a cumulative effect on human consciousness, slowly eroding the mental barriers that normally protected the psyche from direct contact with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Ford's dreams became increasingly vivid and strange, filled with geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate and whispered conversations in languages that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to deeper, more primitive layers of his brain. He began to experience episodes of lost time, finding himself in locations within his laboratory with no memory of how he had arrived there, often surrounded by research equipment that had been arranged in patterns he did not remember creating. But rather than recognizing these symptoms as warning signs of psychological deterioration brought on by prolonged exposure to supernatural forces, Ford interpreted them as evidence of his expanding consciousness and his growing connection to the cosmic truths that lay hidden beneath the surface of apparent reality. He convinced himself that his mind was evolving, adapting to comprehend mysteries that lesser intellects could never hope to understand. It was during one of these episodes of altered consciousness that Ford first encountered the entity that would ultimately become both his greatest source of validation and the instrument of his final damnation. The being that introduced itself as Bill Cipher appeared to Ford not as the cosmic horror it truly was, but as a fellow intellectual, a kindred spirit whose vast knowledge and interdimensional perspective made him the perfect collaborator for research that transcended the narrow boundaries of conventional science. Bill's initial approach was masterfully calculated to appeal to every weakness in Ford's character, every desperate need and unhealed wound that decades of isolation and academic obsession had carved into his psyche. The entity presented itself as impressed by Ford's work, fascinated by his unique perspective, and eager to share knowledge that would revolutionize human understanding of the universe's true nature. For Ford, who had spent his entire adult life craving recognition from intellectual peers who could truly appreciate the significance of his discoveries, Bill's arrival felt like the answer to prayers he had not even realized he was making. Here, finally, was a being whose knowledge dwarfed even his own, yet who treated him as an equal partner rather than a junior colleague or student. The information that Bill began to share with Ford was genuinely revolutionary, offering insights into the fundamental structure of reality that was centuries ahead of mainstream scientific understanding. Mathematical formulas that could calculate the precise location of dimensional weak points, engineering principles that could harness energies from alternate realities, biological theories that explained the existence of creatures that defied conventional taxonomy. All of this and more flowed from Bill's vast intellect into Ford's eager and unquestioning mind. But what Ford failed to recognize, blinded as he was by his desperate hunger for validation and his intoxicating sense of finally having found his intellectual equal, was that Bill's generosity came with a price that would eventually consume not only Ford himself, but potentially every sentient being across multiple dimensions. The knowledge that Bill shared was not offered out of academic generosity or intellectual camaraderie, but as bait in a trap so sophisticated and long-term that its true scope would not become apparent until it was far too late to prevent its catastrophic consequences. The portal that Ford began constructing under Bill's guidance was presented to him as the ultimate scientific achievement, a device that would allow direct observation and study of alternate dimensions, opening up infinite possibilities for research and discovery. Bill explained that such a portal would make Ford the most famous scientist in human history, the man who had finally proven that reality extended far beyond the narrow confines of a single universe. Ford threw himself into the portal's construction with the same obsessive intensity that had characterized all his academic pursuits, working around the clock to perfect every component and calibrate every system according to Bill's increasingly detailed specifications. The project consumed months of his life and vast amounts of his financial resources, but he convinced himself that the eventual payoff would justify any sacrifice. What Ford never stopped to consider, despite his supposed intellectual brilliance, was why an entity with Bill's vast knowledge and dimensional capabilities would need a human partner to construct such a device. If Bill possessed the scientific understanding necessary to design the portal, surely he also possessed the power to build it himself, without requiring the assistance of a primitive three-dimensional being whose knowledge was laughably limited by comparison. The truth, which Ford's ego and desperation prevented him from recognizing, was that Bill required a willing human collaborator, not because he lacked the ability to construct the portal himself, but because the device's true purpose demanded the voluntary participation of a being native to the dimension he intended to invade. The portal was not designed to allow Ford to study other realities, but to provide Bill with a permanent gateway between his nightmare dimension and the physical universe, a doorway that could only be opened by someone who chose to do so of their own free will. Ford's growing dependence on Bill's validation and intellectual companionship made him increasingly blind to the warning signs that should have alerted him to his collaboration's true nature. The entity's occasional displays of alien cruelty, his references to conquest and domination, his obvious contempt for human life and consciousness. All of these red flags were dismissed or rationalized away by a mind that had become so addicted to Bill's approval that it was willing to ignore even the most obvious evidence of malevolent intent. The few attempts by outsiders to warn Ford about the dangerous path he was following were met with intellectual arrogance and dismissive contempt. His graduate assistant Fiddleford McGucket, whose own brilliance in engineering and computer science should have commanded Ford's respect, tried repeatedly to express concerns about the portal project and its potential consequences, only to be brushed aside as a small-minded individual who lacked the vision to comprehend truly revolutionary science. When McGucket's exposure to the portal's dimensional energies during its initial testing phases caused him to experience traumatic visions of cosmic horror and multiversal destruction, Ford's response was not concern for his friend's well-being but irritation at what he perceived as an irrational obstacle to his research. Rather than taking McGucket's warnings seriously or investigating the psychological effects that his work might be having on those exposed to it, Ford allowed his assistant to use the memory gun to erase his traumatic experiences. effectively enabling what would eventually become a complete psychological breakdown. The Society of the Blind Eye that McGucket eventually founded was not simply an organization of people seeking to forget unpleasant encounters with the supernatural, but a desperate attempt by a brilliant mind to protect the community from knowledge that was quite literally too dangerous for human consciousness to process safely. McGucket had glimpsed the true scope of what Ford's portal would unleash upon the world, and his attempts to create a network of selective amnesia represented one of the few genuinely heroic acts in the entire sordid history of Gravity Falls supernatural research. But Ford, consumed by his obsession and blinded by his need for validation, saw McGucket's deteriorating mental state and eventual departure not as tragic consequences of exposure to cosmic horror, but as proof that lesser minds simply could not handle the revolutionary nature of his work. He convinced himself that he was stronger than his assistant, more mentally resilient, better equipped to handle direct contact with forces that existed beyond human comprehension. This arrogance would prove to be his most fatal flaw, for while Ford's intellectual capabilities were indeed exceptional by human standards, they were still bound by the fundamental limitations of three-dimensional consciousness, attempting to process information from realms where basic logic and causality followed entirely different principles. His mind, no matter how brilliant, was not designed to serve as a conduit for the kind of knowledge that Bill represented, and prolonged exposure to such information was slowly driving him toward the same psychological breakdown that had claimed McGucket. The final phase of the portal's construction coincided with a period of increasing instability in Ford's mental state, as months of sleep deprivation, social isolation, and exposure to dimensional energies began to take their inevitable toll on his psychological well-being. He began to experience episodes of possession, moments when Bill would take direct control of his body to advance the portal project while Ford's consciousness was pushed into a passive observer role. These violations of his mental autonomy should have served as the ultimate warning about the true nature of his relationship with Bill, clear evidence that he was not a valued partner, but merely a useful tool to be manipulated and discarded once his purpose had been served. Yet even these direct assaults on his free will were rationalized away by a mind so desperate for validation and so committed to its chosen path that it was willing to accept any abuse rather than admit that its fundamental assumptions might have been wrong. The moment when Ford finally recognized Bill's true nature and began to understand the catastrophic scope of what he had been manipulated into creating came far too late to prevent the disaster he had set in motion. His desperate attempts to shut down the portal and destroy his research represented not redemption but merely damage control, the frantic actions of a man who had finally awakened to find himself standing at the center of an apocalyptic scenario of his own creation. His decision to hide the journals and scatter their contents was similarly too little, too late. The portal itself remained intact, requiring only the reunification of the journals and the input of specific activation sequences to complete the work that Ford and Bill had begun together. By creating a puzzle that could eventually be solved by determined individuals, Ford had essentially ensured that his moment of clarity and attempted withdrawal would prove temporary, that eventually someone would complete what he had started regardless of his belated change of heart. The 30 years that Ford spent trapped in alternate dimensions, while certainly harrowing and educational, served more as an extended punishment for his crimes against reality than as any form of meaningful atonement. His travels through the multiverse showed him the scope of Bill's influence and the scale of destruction that entities like the Dream Demon could inflict upon unsuspecting civilizations. But this knowledge came at the cost of leaving his own dimension vulnerable to the very forces he now claimed to oppose. His eventual return to Gravity Falls, facilitated by the reactivation of the portal he had tried so desperately to shut down, brought him face to face, not with the hero's welcome he might have expected, but with the undeniable evidence of how his academic arrogance and desperate need for validation had poisoned everything and everyone he had ever claimed to care about. The brother who had sacrificed 30 years of his life to bring Ford home had been transformed by that experience into something harder and more morally ambiguous, while the town itself had become a supernatural tourist trap built on the very phenomena that Ford's research had helped to amplify and legitimize. Perhaps most damning of all was Ford's reaction to discovering that his great-nephew Dipper had become fascinated with the journals and the mysteries they contained. Rather than recognizing in the boy's curiosity a dangerous echo of his own youthful obsession, Ford encouraged Dipper's interest and even considered taking him on as an apprentice, apparently blind to the obvious parallels between his current situation and his own relationship with Bill Cipher decades earlier. This willingness to potentially doom another generation to repeat his own mistakes revealed the ultimate tragedy of Stanford Pines, that even after witnessing firsthand the consequences of unchecked intellectual arrogance and the seductive appeal of forbidden knowledge, he remained fundamentally unchanged in the character flaws that had led to his original downfall. His time in the multiverse had given him new information and new perspectives, but it had not cured him of the desperate need for validation and the dangerous conviction that his exceptional intelligence gave him the right to make decisions whose consequences would be borne by everyone except himself. The man who returned from 30 years of interdimensional exile was, in all the ways that truly mattered, the same person who had once eagerly collaborated with a cosmic horror in the construction of a doomsday device. Older, certainly, and more experienced in the varieties of supernatural threat that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality, but still fundamentally driven by the same toxic combination of intellectual pride and emotional neediness that had made him such a perfect target for Bill's manipulation in the first place. The knowledge he brought back from his travels, while certainly useful in the immediate crisis of Weirdmageddon, could never compensate for the fact that the crisis itself existed because of choices he had made and actions he had taken in pursuit of academic glory and personal validation. Every life lost, every reality damaged, every dimension scarred by Bill's rampage across the multiverse could be traced back to a lonely man in a forest laboratory who had been so desperate to feel special that he had willingly opened a door between worlds without bothering to consider what might choose to walk through it. In the end, Stanford Pines represents perhaps the most dangerous type of villain. Not the cackling madman who knows he serves evil, but the brilliant fool who convinces himself that his noble intentions justify any means, any risk, any sacrifice of others' well-being in service of his own grand vision. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the seductive appeal of forbidden knowledge and the terrible price that can be exacted when intellectual curiosity is divorced from wisdom, humility, and genuine care for the welfare of others. Stanley Pines entered the world 17 minutes after his twin brother, a delay that would prove prophetic of a life spent perpetually arriving second to opportunities that had already been claimed by someone else. Yet where Stanford's extra fingers marked him as different in ways that attracted both ridicule and academic attention, Stanley's normalcy condemned him to a far more insidious form of invisibility, the fate of being overlooked, dismissed, and ultimately forgotten by a world that had already decided his brother was the one worth watching. In the cramped quarters of the Pines family home in Glass Shard Beach, New Jersey, young Stanley learned early that love and attention were finite resources that had to be competed for rather than freely given. His parents, while not intentionally cruel, fell into the trap that ensnares so many families blessed and cursed with twins of dramatically different abilities. Stanford's academic achievements provided them with something to boast about to neighbors and relatives, a source of pride that made their modest circumstances seem less shameful in a society that measured worth through success and recognition. Stanley's contributions to the family dynamic were less tangible and therefore less valued. His natural charisma, his ability to diffuse tense situations with humor, his instinctive understanding of people's emotional needs, these qualities, while arguably more important for long-term happiness and relationship success, generated no report cards that could be proudly displayed on refrigerator doors, no teacher conferences where glowing praise could be received and treasured. The boxing lessons that became Stanley's primary avenue for gaining his father's approval were themselves a form of gentle cruelty, an implicit acknowledgement that since he could not compete with his brother intellectually, he would have to find other ways to prove his worth as a son. The hours spent in dingy gyms learning to absorb and deliver punishment taught Stanley lessons about survival that would serve him well in the criminal underworld he would eventually inhabit. But they also reinforced his growing conviction that violence was the only language he spoke fluently enough to command respect. His academic struggles, while partly due to undiagnosed learning differences that the educational system of the 1970s was ill-equipped to identify or address, were exacerbated by his unconscious adoption of failure as a form of identity. In a household where Stanford's brilliance cast such a long shadow, Stanley found a perverse comfort in fulfilling the role of the problem child, the disappointment, the brother who could be counted on to fall short of expectations. The scheme that ultimately led to Stanford's rejection from West Coast Tech was not born from malice, but from a desperate, misguided attempt to level the playing field between them. Stanley had finally found something, their shared dream of sailing around the world together as adventurers and treasure hunters, that mattered more to him than his brother's academic success, and he was willing to sabotage that success to preserve their partnership. The broken, perpetual motion machine that cost Stanford his scholarship was Stanley's way of saying what he could never articulate directly, that he needed his brother more than the world needed another brilliant scientist, that their childhood bond was more precious than any university education, that he was terrified of being left behind once again while Stanford moved on to achievements and relationships that would have no room for a failure like him. But Stanford's reaction to this act of desperate love disguised as sabotage revealed the fundamental incompatibility in their relationship that would poison the next 30 years of both their lives. Where Stanley had acted from emotional need and familial attachment, Stanford could only see betrayal and destruction, the willful ruin of his carefully constructed path to academic glory. The conversation that followed the discovery of the sabotage became a moment of mutual revelation that neither brother was equipped to handle with wisdom or compassion. Stanford's words, his declaration that Stanley had ruined his life, his suggestion that Stanley's future held nothing but failure and disappointment, were spoken in pain and anger, but they landed on psychological wounds that had been festering for years. For Stanley, who had already internalized the message that he was less valuable than his brother, Stanford's rejection felt like the final confirmation of his worthlessness, the moment when even the person who was supposed to love him unconditionally had finally given up on him. The physical fight that erupted between them was really a battle over competing visions of their shared future, but it was also something deeper and more tragic, the death throes of a relationship that had been slowly poisoned by years of comparison, competition, and unequal treatment. When their father arrived to find them bloodied and furious, his decision to throw Stanley out of the house was presented as punishment for starting the fight, but it was really the family's acknowledgement that they had always seen him as expendable. The 17-year-old boy who walked away from Glass Shard Beach with nothing but the clothes on his back and a handful of crumpled bills was not yet a criminal. but he was already damaged in ways that would make criminal behavior seem like a reasonable response to an unreasonable world. Stanley's descent into the underworld was not a sudden fall from grace, but a gradual slide down a slope that had been greased by years of neglect, disappointment, and emotional abandonment. His first crimes were small-scale cons and petty thefts, desperate attempts to survive on the streets of cities where a teenager with no connections, no references, and no legitimate skills had very few options for generating income. The fake watches and rigged card games that became his early stock in trade were not motivated by greed but by hunger, not by a desire to hurt others but by a need to avoid being hurt himself. But crime, like any other profession, has its own learning curve and its own systems of advancement, and Stanley proved to have a natural aptitude for the psychological manipulation and situational awareness that successful criminal careers require. His years of reading people's emotions and deflecting family tension had given him skills that translated surprisingly well to the world of confidence games and small-time fraud. The name changes that became a regular feature of his adult life were not simply practical measures to avoid law enforcement, though they certainly served that purpose. Each new identity represented Stanley's attempt to shed the accumulated shame and failure of his previous incarnations, to become someone who had not been rejected by his family or disappointed everyone who had ever tried to believe in him. Stanley Pines became Stanford, Pines became Hal, Forrester became Steve Pinington, became a dozen other names that represented a dozen other attempts to find a version of himself that could succeed where all previous versions had failed. But identity, unlike clothing, cannot be changed simply by adopting new external trappings, and the fundamental wounds that drove Stanley's self-destructive behavior remained unchanged, regardless of what name appeared on his forged identification documents. The escalation of his criminal activities from petty cons to more serious offenses was driven partly by necessity as law enforcement agencies began to track his activities across state lines. He needed bigger scores to make the increasing risks worthwhile, but also by his growing conviction that he was irredeemably corrupt, a person who had been born broken and could never be fixed. The stint in Colombian prison that nearly cost Stanley his life was the direct result of a con gone wrong, but it was also the logical endpoint of a criminal career built on increasingly desperate attempts to prove his worth through financial success. The drug dealers who had hired him for what was supposed to be a simple smuggling operation had no interest in his psychological motivations or his complicated relationship with his own self-worth. They simply wanted results, and when those results were not delivered, they responded with the kind of violence that left permanent scars on both body and soul. The months Stanley spent in that hellish facility, surrounded by men who had committed acts that made his own crimes seem like childish pranks, taught him lessons about survival and moral compromise that would shape the rest of his life. He learned to do things during that period that he would never be able to discuss with another human being, acts of violence and betrayal that were necessary for staying alive, but which carved away pieces of his humanity that could never be recovered. When he finally escaped from that prison, the man who emerged was fundamentally different from the teenager who had been kicked out of his family home years earlier. The capacity for genuine trust, for emotional vulnerability, for the kind of open-hearted connection that healthy relationships require, all of these had been burned away by experiences that no human being should ever have to endure. The postcard from Stanford that reached him during this period of reconstruction and emotional numbness should have been a moment of joy, a sign that the brother he had never stopped loving despite everything that had passed between them was finally ready to reconcile. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most morally complex decision of Stanley's life, a choice that would define the next 3 decades and ultimately determine the fate of multiple dimensions. The Stanford who greeted Stanley at the cabin in Gravity Falls was clearly not the brother he remembered from their teenage years. Paranoid, sleep-deprived, and consumed by obsessions that made very little sense to someone who had spent the intervening years focused on basic survival rather than theoretical physics, Ford seemed to have transformed from a brilliant but arrogant young man into something approaching a legitimate madman. The story Ford told about his research, about the supernatural entities he had encountered, and especially about his relationship with an interdimensional being called Bill Cipher, should have triggered every warning instinct that Stanley had developed during his years in the criminal underworld. The account had all the hallmarks of a paranoid delusion, the kind of grandiose narrative that unbalanced minds construct to explain their isolation and failures. But Stanley's capacity for rational judgment had been compromised by his own desperate need for reconciliation with the only family member who had ever mattered to him. The possibility that Ford was experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown was less important than the fact that Ford had reached out to him, had acknowledged needing his help, had finally treated him as someone whose assistance was valuable. The journal that Ford pressed into his hands represented both a confession and a burden, a detailed account of research that had apparently attracted the attention of cosmic forces beyond human comprehension. Stanley's inability to fully understand the scientific and supernatural concepts described in Ford's notes was not simply a matter of educational limitations, but a form of psychological protection, a mercy that spared him from grappling with implications that had already driven his brother to the edge of sanity. Ford's instructions were clear enough in their broad outlines, even if their specific details remained mystifying. The portal that he had constructed in the basement laboratory was dangerous beyond imagination and had to be destroyed permanently. The journals that documented its construction had to be separated and hidden where they could never be reunited. And Stanley himself had to leave Gravity Falls immediately and never return, for his own safety and for the safety of everyone else. The fight that erupted between them was not really about the portal or the journals, or even about the supernatural forces that Ford claimed were pursuing him. It was the culmination of 30 years of unresolved anger, hurt, and mutual incomprehension, a final confrontation between two men who had never learned to communicate their needs and fears in ways that the other could understand. When Stanley pushed Ford away from the control panel in his desperation to be heard, when Ford stumbled backward toward the portal that was already beginning to activate, when the gravitational forces generated by the machine pulled his brother into the dimensional rift that immediately sealed itself behind him, all of this happened too quickly for conscious decision-making, too suddenly, for either of them to fully process what was occurring. The silence that followed Ford's disappearance was the loudest sound that Stanley had ever heard, a crushing absence of noise that seemed to echo with 30 years of wasted opportunities for reconciliation and understanding. He was alone in a basement laboratory surrounded by incomprehensible machinery, holding journals filled with scientific concepts that might as well have been written in a foreign language, responsible for a disappearance that he could never explain to anyone without sounding completely insane. The decision to assume Ford's identity was not made in a single moment of calculating premeditation, but evolved gradually over the hours and days following the accident. Stanley's initial plan was simply to find some way to reactivate the portal and bring his brother back, but this required understanding technology that was decades ahead of anything being developed by mainstream science, and based on theoretical principles that challenged the fundamental assumptions of known physics. The transformation of Stanford Pines, the reclusive researcher, into Stanford Pines, the eccentric tourist attraction, was perhaps the most audacious and long-sustained confidence game in the history of American crime. Stanley had to convincingly portray not just a different person, but a different type of person. A adopting mannerisms and knowledge that belonged to someone whose entire life experience had been dramatically different from his own. The mystery shack that he created was both a practical necessity — he needed some form of legitimate income to fund his portal research — and a form of psychological armor, a way of hiding his desperate search for his brother behind the facade of harmless entrepreneurial eccentricity. The fake exhibits and manufactured mysteries that drew tourists from around the world served as cover for experiments and investigations that would have attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement or government agencies if their true nature had been understood. But the deeper tragedy of Stanley's impersonation was not its practical difficulties, but its emotional cost. Every day that he spent pretending to be his brother was another day of denying his own existence, another step in the gradual erasure of his identity in favor of someone who was smarter, more accomplished, and more worthy of respect and admiration. The skills that Stanley had developed during his criminal career, the ability to read people's expectations and reflect them back, the talent for creating convincing narratives from fragments of truth, the capacity to maintain multiple deceptions simultaneously, all proved invaluable in maintaining the Stanford Pines persona. But these same skills trapped him in a performance that became more consuming and exhausting with each passing year. The few relationships that Stanley formed during his decades in Gravity Falls were poisoned from their inception by the fundamental dishonesty at their core. Every friendship was built on lies. Every moment of human connection was contaminated by the knowledge that the person who seemed to be growing closer to him was actually becoming attached to someone who did not exist. The romantic relationships that occasionally developed were perhaps the cruelest casualties of Stanley's deception. Women who found themselves drawn to the mysterious and eccentric Stanford Pines were unknowingly falling in love with an elaborate fiction, and Stanley's growing attachment to them was always haunted by the knowledge that they could never truly know or accept him as he actually was. The loneliness that this created was not the simple isolation of someone who chooses to avoid social contact, but the far more devastating alienation of someone who desperately craves connection while knowing that genuine intimacy would destroy the carefully constructed illusion on which his entire life depended. Stanley became a ghost, haunting his own existence, watching from behind a mask as other people formed relationships with someone who existed only as a performance. The research itself, the desperate attempt to understand Ford's work well enough to recreate and reverse it, consumed Stanley's nights and haunted his days with a complexity that pushed his cognitive abilities far beyond their normal limits. The mathematical formulas and dimensional physics that filled Ford's journals were not simply difficult but actively hostile to comprehension by minds not specifically trained in their interpretation. The gradual progress that Stanley made in understanding the portal's operation came at a tremendous cost in terms of mental exhaustion and psychological stress. Each breakthrough in comprehension was accompanied by the growing realization of how dangerous the forces he was attempting to manipulate truly were, how his brother's research had brought him into contact with entities and energies that could destroy not just individual lives but entire realities. The machines and devices that Stanley constructed in his attempt to reactivate the portal were crude approximations of Ford's elegant engineering, held together by determination and luck rather than sophisticated understanding of the underlying principles. Every test activation was a roll of cosmic dice, a risk that could result in anything from minor equipment failure to the complete destruction of the Pacific Northwest. The financial cost of maintaining this research while simultaneously operating the Mystery Shack and preserving the illusion of Stanford's identity created pressures that drove Stanley back toward the criminal behavior he had hoped to leave behind. The tax evasion and minor frauds that supplemented his tourist income were not motivated by greed but by desperation, not by a desire to cheat the system but by the need to fund research that could potentially save his brother's life. The arrival of Dipper and Mabel Pines for their summer vacation created a crisis that Stanley had been dreading for years. Children, with their natural curiosity and lack of adult inhibitions about asking uncomfortable questions, posed a far greater threat to his carefully maintained deception than any government investigator or suspicious neighbor ever could. His decision to allow them to stay, despite the obvious risks, was not based on rational calculation, but on emotional needs that he had spent decades suppressing. The opportunity to have family members close by, even if they could not know his true identity, was too precious to sacrifice, even for the sake of maintaining the security that his brother's rescue mission required. The summer that followed became a careful balancing act between protecting the children from the supernatural dangers that permeated Gravity Falls, continuing his portal research without arousing their suspicion, and maintaining the Stanford Pines persona convincingly enough that two intelligent children who shared his genetic heritage would not recognize the deception. Each close call, each moment when his true identity nearly surfaced, added another layer of stress to an already unsustainable situation. The lies required to explain inconsistencies in his behavior or knowledge became increasingly elaborate and difficult to maintain, while the growing emotional attachment he felt toward his great-niece and great-nephew made the prospect of eventual discovery more terrifying rather than less. The children's encounters with the supernatural entities and phenomena that Ford's research had catalogued forced Stanley to confront the reality that his brother's work had not simply attracted academic attention from interdimensional beings, but had fundamentally altered the nature of Gravity Falls itself. The town had become a nexus point for supernatural activity, a place where the normal laws of physics and reality operated under different rules, and everyone who spent time there was exposed to influences that could have permanent effects on their psychological and spiritual well-being. Stanley's growing realization that he had been putting Dipper and Mabel in danger simply by allowing them to remain in Gravity Falls was complicated by his equally strong conviction that sending them away would leave them vulnerable to other threats that he was even less equipped to protect them from. The supernatural forces that his brother had awakened were not confined to the boundaries of their small Oregon town, but were spreading their influence through networks of connection and contamination that could reach anywhere in the boundaries of their small Oregon town. World, the moment when the portal finally activated and Ford returned after 30 years of interdimensional exile, should have been the culmination of Stanley's heroic efforts and the beginning of their long overdue reconciliation. Instead, it became another source of conflict and disappointment, as Ford's first reaction to his rescue was not gratitude, but anger about the risks that Stanley had taken and the deceptions he had employed. The fight that broke out between them in front of Dipper and Mabel was not simply about the portal or the dangers of its operation, but about 30 years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Ford's inability to recognize the magnitude of Stanley's sacrifice, his focus on the technical risks rather than the emotional costs, his assumption that Stanley had been motivated by recklessness rather than love. All of this revealed that his time in the multiverse had not cured him of the character flaws that had driven them apart in the first place. Stanley's decision to fake his own death during the final confrontation with Bill's cipher was presented to his family as the ultimate act of heroism, a willing sacrifice of his own identity to save not just his loved ones, but potentially every sentient being across multiple dimensions. The memory wipe that erased his personality and left him a blank slate was portrayed as a tragic but necessary price for victory over cosmic evil. But the deeper truth about Stanley's sacrifice was more complex and more troubling than the heroic narrative that his family chose to embrace. The decision to allow Bill to enter his mind, knowing that the resulting memory wipe would destroy everything that made him who he was was not simply about saving others, but about escaping from a life that had become unbearable under the weight of decades of deception, isolation, and accumulated trauma. The Stanley Pines who chose to have his memory erased was a man who had spent 30 years living a lie so comprehensive that he could no longer remember what his authentic self had felt like. The prospect of returning to his original identity, of having to explain and justify his actions to people who had every right to feel betrayed by his deceptions, of living with the knowledge of all the pain his choices had caused. All of this may have seemed more frightening than the alternative of complete psychological erasure, the restoration of his memories that followed. While certainly touching and emotionally satisfying for the family members who participated in the process, could never truly undo the damage that had been done, not just to Stanley himself, but to everyone whose lives had been affected by his decades of systematic dishonesty. The man who remembered being Stanley Pines was not the same person who had first assumed his brother's identity, but someone who had been fundamentally transformed by experiences that could never be fully shared or understood by others. The decision to finally reveal his true identity to Suze and Wendy, to the community of Gravity Falls, and to the wider world was presented as a moment of liberation and authentic self-revelation. But it was also a form of cruelty toward all the people who had formed relationships with Stanford Pines over the years, who had trusted and cared for someone who had never existed except as an elaborate performance. The psychological damage inflicted on everyone who discovered that they had been systematically deceived for decades was never fully acknowledged or addressed. The friends who had confided in Ford, the romantic partners who had believed they were getting to know him, the community members who had trusted him with their secrets and vulnerabilities, all of them were forced to reconstruct their understanding of their own lives and relationships in light of the revelation that someone they had cared about was actually a stranger wearing a mask. In the end, Stanley Pines represents perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire Gravity Falls narrative, not because his story lacks redemptive elements, but because his redemption comes at a cost that extends far beyond his own suffering to encompass everyone whose life was touched by his deception. His transformation from a neglected child to a career criminal to a heroic guardian was motivated throughout by genuine love and desperate need for connection. But these worthy motivations could never justify the systematic violation of trust that his heroic acts required. The man who finally sailed away from Gravity Falls with his brother was not the same Stanley who had first arrived at Ford's cabin 30 years earlier, nor was he the Stanford whose identity he had assumed for so long. He was something new and unprecedented, a person whose very existence was built on the psychological and emotional wreckage of everyone who had ever tried to know him, whose happiness was purchased with other people's pain, whose redemption required the destruction of countless relationships that could never be restored to their original innocence. Stanley Pines had become, through necessity and circumstance rather than malicious intent, the necessary monster that his family's survival required. But the word necessary could never transform the word monster into something clean or noble or easy to live with. His story serves as a reminder that even the most heroic actions can be tainted by the methods required to accomplish them, and that some forms of love are so desperate and destructive that they become indistinguishable from the cruelest forms of betrayal. The children who arrived at the Mystery Shack on that warm summer day in late June carried within their 12-year-old hearts and minds a darkness that neither they nor their well-meaning family members could have recognized or understood. Mason Pines and Mabel Pines were not simply innocent twins embarking on a carefree summer adventure, but vessels already prepared by genetics, trauma, and cosmic circumstance to serve as conduits for forces that would corrupt their souls and damn their futures in ways that would not become fully apparent until years later, when the true scope of their spiritual contamination could finally be measured. Dipper, as he insisted on being called in what he believed was a harmless assertion of individual identity, bore the psychological scars of a childhood spent feeling inadequate in ways that echoed and amplified the generational curse that had already consumed his great-uncles. His intellectual precocity, while genuinely impressive by the standards of normal 12-year-old development, was coupled with an obsessive need for validation that made him uniquely vulnerable to the same seductive promises of forbidden knowledge that had ultimately destroyed Stanford Pines. The birthmark on his forehead that resembled the constellation Ursa Major was not simply a curious coincidence, but a physical manifestation of his deeper connection to cosmic forces that operated beyond the boundaries of normal human understanding. Ancient texts on stellar mysticism, written by civilizations that had long since vanished from mortal memory, spoke of children born bearing the marks of specific constellations as being destined to serve as bridges between the earthly realm and the vast intelligences that moved among the stars. From his earliest memories, Dipper had experienced dreams that were far too vivid and structurally complex to be dismissed as normal products of childhood imagination. These nocturnal visions carried him to landscapes that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions, where geometric shapes moved with purposeful intelligence, and whispered conversations took place in mathematical languages that bypassed his conscious mind to speak directly to deeper layers of his developing psyche. His twin sister Mabel represented a different but equally troubling form of spiritual vulnerability. Her apparently boundless optimism and cheerful disposition serving as a psychological defense mechanism against truths too terrible for a child's mind to process consciously. Where Dipper's corruption would manifest as obsessive pursuit of dangerous knowledge, Mabel's would take the form of reality denial so profound that it bordered on dissociative disorder. The rainbow sweaters that had become her trademark were not simply expressions of artistic creativity, but unconscious attempts to surround herself with symbols of hope and beauty that could serve as barriers against the encroaching darkness she sensed but could not name. Her obsession with crafting, with creating physical objects that brought order and meaning to chaotic materials, represented a desperate attempt to impose her will upon a universe that she instinctively understood was far more hostile and unpredictable than the adults in her life were willing to acknowledge. The family dynamics that had shaped both children's psychological development had been poisoned from birth by traumas that stretched back through multiple generations of Pine's family history. Their parents' marriage, already strained by economic pressures and personal incompatibilities, had been further damaged by their unconscious awareness that their children were somehow different from other kids, marked by characteristics that no amount of normal parenting could adequately address or protect them from. The decision to send the twins to spend their summer with their great-uncle Stanford was not made out of simple convenience or family bonding desires, but from a desperate parental instinct that their children needed to be somewhere else, away from whatever influences were affecting their development in ways that defied rational explanation. Their mother's growing alcoholism and their father's increasing emotional withdrawal were symptoms of their exposure to energies that radiated from their own offspring, cosmic contamination that spread through family systems like a spiritual contagion. The bus ride that carried Dipper and Mabel from California to Oregon was not simply a journey across geographical distance, but a pilgrimage toward a destiny that had been written into their genetic code long before they were born. Each mile that brought them closer to Gravity Falls increased the strength of the supernatural forces that were already beginning to influence their thoughts, dreams, and perceptions in ways that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their lives. The Mystery Shack itself, when they first laid eyes upon its weathered walls and eccentric architecture, felt like a homecoming rather than an arrival at an unfamiliar destination. The building recognized them on levels that transcended normal sensory experience, welcoming them not as visitors, but as long-awaited participants in rituals and ceremonies that had been prepared for their arrival across decades of careful planning by intelligences that existed beyond the normal boundaries of time and space. Stanley's nervousness about their presence was not simply the natural anxiety of a man unaccustomed to caring for children, but an unconscious recognition that their arrival marked the beginning of a new phase in Gravity Falls' supernatural evolution. The portal research that had consumed 30 years of his life had been unconsciously designed not just to rescue his brother, but to prepare the town for the arrival of the next generation of vessels through which cosmic forces could extend their influence into the physical world. Dipper's discovery of the journal hidden in the forest was not the result of random chance or simple curiosity, but the fulfillment of a destiny that had been orchestrated by forces that understood the deep psychological needs and vulnerabilities that would make him unable to resist pursuing the forbidden knowledge contained within its pages. The book called to him across dimensional barriers, its very existence serving as a beacon that drew him toward truths that would ultimately consume his childhood innocence and replace it with obsessions that would define the rest of his life. The moment when he first opened the journal's cover and saw the strange symbols and disturbing illustrations that filled its pages marked the end of his normal psychological development and the beginning of a transformation that would gradually strip away his humanity in favor of something darker and more cosmically aligned. Each page he turned, each creature he catalogued, each mystery he attempted to solve, drew him deeper into a web of knowledge that was specifically designed to be addictive to minds like his own. The supernatural encounters that followed their arrival in Gravity Falls were not random events but carefully orchestrated experiences designed to gradually acclimate the twins to levels of reality distortion that would have driven normal children into immediate psychological collapse. The gnomes that attempted to kidnap Mabel were not simply forest creatures seeking a queen, but agents of forces that were testing her capacity to maintain psychological coherence in the face of impossible situations. Dipper's response to these encounters revealed the fundamental flaw in his character that would ultimately lead to his spiritual damnation. Where a healthy child might have been traumatized by exposure to beings that violated every assumption about the nature of reality, Dipper found himself energized and excited, drawn to the mystery and danger, rather than repelled by their obvious threat to his safety and sanity. His growing obsession with documenting and understanding the paranormal phenomena he encountered was not motivated by scientific curiosity, but by the same desperate need for validation through intellectual achievement that had already consumed his great-uncle Stanford. Each creature he identified, each mystery he solved, each dangerous situation he survived, fed his growing conviction that he was special, chosen, destined for greatness in ways that normal children could never understand or appreciate. Mabel's parallel development took a different but equally troubling path, as her exposure to supernatural forces gradually eroded her ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, in ways that allowed her to function superficially, normally, while becoming increasingly detached from genuine human emotion and authentic interpersonal connection. Her romantic obsessions with boys who clearly had no interest in her were not simply normal preteen crushes, but desperate attempts to anchor herself to human relationships before her growing spiritual corruption made such connections impossible. The craft supplies and art projects that filled her side of their shared bedroom served not as expressions of creativity, but as magical talismans designed to ward off the encroaching awareness that everything she believed about the nature of reality was fundamentally wrong. Each friendship bracelet she wove, each scrapbook page she decorated, each sweater she knitted, was an unconscious ritual designed to impose order and meaning upon a universe that she was beginning to understand, operated according to principles of chaos and malevolent intelligence. The dynamic between the twins themselves became increasingly unhealthy as their summer progressed, each feeding off the other's growing dysfunction in ways that amplified their individual spiritual corruption. Dipper's obsession with solving mysteries created situations that put both of them in danger, while Mabel's reality denial prevented her from recognizing or responding appropriately to the genuine threats they faced on an almost daily basis. Their codependency, which their family had always viewed as a charming aspect of their close sibling relationship, was actually a form of mutual psychological contamination that prevented either of them from developing the individual strength and clarity of purpose that might have allowed them to resist the forces that were gradually consuming their souls. They had become spiritually conjoined in ways that made it impossible for either to achieve psychological independence or moral clarity. The creatures and entities they encountered throughout their summer were not random inhabitants of a generally supernatural environment, but specific agents of corruption, assigned to test and develop different aspects of their growing spiritual darkness. The gnomes who had attempted to kidnap Mabel were evaluating her capacity for denial and self-deception, while the various monsters that threatened Dipper were measuring his willingness to sacrifice others' safety in pursuit of knowledge and personal validation. The Summerween incident that brought them into contact with the trickster represented a crucial turning point in their corruption, as both twins demonstrated their willingness to participate in deception and manipulation when it served their immediate emotional needs. The candy they gave to the entity was not simply a peace offering, but a form of spiritual tribute, acknowledging their growing allegiance to forces that operated outside normal, moral, and ethical boundaries. Dipper's encounters with the Manitors revealed his deep-seated insecurities about his own masculinity and physical capabilities, vulnerabilities that made him susceptible to influences that promised to make him stronger and more confident through the adoption of values and behaviors that were fundamentally incompatible with human civilization. His participation in their crude rituals and his adoption of their philosophy of dominance through violence marked his first conscious embrace of principles that would eventually separate him completely from normal human society. The most significant and damaging event of their summer was undoubtedly Dipper's possession by Bill Cipher, an experience that left permanent scars on his psyche that would influence every subsequent decision he made for the rest of his life. The deal he made with the Dream Demon was not simply a desperate attempt to solve a supernatural mystery, but a conscious choice to allow cosmic evil direct access to his mind and soul in exchange for temporary power and knowledge. The violation of his consciousness that followed was not merely traumatic but transformative, as Bill's presence within his mental landscape left behind traces of alien thought patterns and moral frameworks that would gradually overwrite his human psychological development. The knowledge he gained during the possession was not simply information but spiritual contamination, seeds of cosmic understanding that would slowly grow within his mind until they completely displaced his original personality and moral orientation. Mabel's role in the possession incident was equally damaging, as her decision to trust Bill, despite obvious warning signs, revealed her complete inability to recognize or respond appropriately to genuine evil. Her collaboration with the demon in manipulating Dipper's unconscious body was not motivated by innocent misunderstanding, but by her growing alignment with forces that valued immediate gratification and personal desire over ethical considerations or concern for others' well-being. The memory of being controlled by an entity whose thoughts operated according to principles of pure malevolence left Dipper with a permanent sense of having been fundamentally contaminated, marked by experiences that separated him from normal human experience in ways that could never be reversed or healed. He had touched the mind of something that existed beyond good and evil as humans understood these concepts, and that touch had left him permanently changed in ways that he could never fully explain to anyone who had not undergone similar corruption. The summer's end brought not relief from the supernatural pressures they had been exposed to, but a desperate realization that returning to their normal lives was no longer possible. They had been changed by their experiences in ways that made conventional childhood development impossible, marked by knowledge and trauma that would influence every relationship and decision for the rest of their lives. Their parents' reaction to their return home revealed the extent to which their corruption had become visible to those who knew them well. The children who came back from Oregon were recognizably different from the ones who had left California, changed in subtle but profound ways that created an unconscious sense of unease in everyone who spent time with them. The academic year that followed their summer in Gravity Falls was characterized by increasingly erratic behavior and declining social connections as both twins struggled to function in normal environments while carrying the weight of knowledge and experiences that had no place in ordinary human society. Dipper's attempts to research and document supernatural phenomena using conventional academic resources led to conflicts with teachers and counselors who could not understand his obsession with subjects that had no place in standard curricula. Mabel's parallel decline took the form of increasing social isolation, as her reality denial mechanisms became too obvious and disturbing for her peer group to ignore or accommodate. Her attempts to maintain friendships with girls who had not been exposed to cosmic horror revealed the growing gap between her psychological development and that of normal children her age, a disparity that would only increase with time. The knowledge that they would be returning to Gravity Falls the following summer created a sense of anticipation that was both thrilling and terrifying, a recognition that they were being drawn back to forces and experiences that they simultaneously craved and feared. Their winter months were spent not in normal childhood activities, but in preparation for their return to a place that they increasingly understood was their true home, the only environment where their corrupted natures could find expression and validation. The letters they exchanged with their great-uncle Stanford during the months between summers revealed the extent to which they had been psychologically prepared to serve as his successors in the work of dimensional research and supernatural investigation. Their questions about his journals and his research were not motivated by simple curiosity, but by a growing compulsion to understand and participate in activities that promised to complete the transformation that had been begun during their first summer. The second summer's arrival brought with it a sense of inevitability, as if all the events of the intervening months had been merely preparation for their true work, as agents of forces that operated beyond normal human understanding. They returned to Gravity Falls, not as visiting grandchildren, but as recruits reporting for duty in a cosmic war that they were only beginning to understand. Soldiers in an army whose ultimate goals and methods remained hidden from their conscious awareness. Their final summer in Gravity Falls would prove to be not the culmination of their childhood adventures, but the completion of their transformation from innocent human children into something darker and more cosmically aligned. The events of Weirdmageddon, when they would be forced to confront the true nature of the forces they had been serving, would strip away the last vestiges of their humanity and reveal what they had truly become through their exposure to influences that no child should ever have been asked to endure. The twins who would eventually leave Gravity Falls for the last time would bear the same names and faces as the children who had first arrived there, but they would be fundamentally different beings, carriers of cosmic corruption who would spend the rest of their lives serving as agents of forces that sought to expand their influence throughout the normal world. Their childhood had been sacrificed on the altar of knowledge too dangerous for human minds to process safely, and the adults who had allowed this to happen would never fully understand the magnitude of what had been lost in pursuit of their own obsessions and psychological needs. In the end, Dipper and Mabel Pines represent perhaps the most tragic casualties of Gravity Falls' supernatural corruption. Children whose natural curiosity and familial loyalty had been weaponized against them by forces that understood how to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities that normal development inevitably creates. Their story serves as a warning about the price of exposing young minds to truths that are meant to be discovered only by those who possess the wisdom and emotional maturity to handle such knowledge responsibly, and as a reminder that some forms of education are so dangerous that they transform learning into a form of spiritual murder. In the spaces between dimensions, where the normal laws of mathematics collapse into writhing impossibilities, and the very concept of existence becomes negotiable rather than absolute, there dwells an entity whose true nature transcends every category that mortal minds have ever devised to classify the phenomena they encounter in their brief flickering passage through reality. Bill Cipher is not simply a demon or a god or an alien intelligence, but something far more fundamental and terrifying, a living embodiment of entropy itself, a conscious manifestation of the universe's inexorable drive toward chaos and dissolution. The triangular form that Bill typically manifests when dealing with three-dimensional beings is not his true shape, but merely the simplest geometric configuration that minds constrained by linear perspective can perceive without immediately collapsing into gibbering madness. His actual existence spans dimensions that have no names in any language spoken by carbon-based life forms, encompassing spatial relationships and temporal configurations that would cause trained physicists to burn their textbooks and abandon their careers in despair. To understand Bill's origins, one must first grasp the concept of dimensional ecology, the idea that realities exist in complex relationships with one another, sharing resources and energy across barriers that most inhabitants of any given universe never become aware of. Just as biological ecosystems on Earth maintain delicate balances between predator and prey species, dimensional systems rely on intricate networks of cause and effect that span multiple realities simultaneously. Bill emerged from this cosmic ecosystem not as a natural evolutionary product, but as a kind of dimensional cancer, a malignant growth that began consuming the reality matrix of his home dimension, with an appetite that could never be satisfied. The Euclidean realm where he first achieved consciousness was a place of perfect geometric harmony, where mathematical principles achieved a kind of aesthetic purity that approached the divine, inhabited by beings whose thoughts followed logical progressions of such beauty and elegance that their contemplation could induce states of transcendent bliss in observers. The inhabitants of this mathematical paradise lived lives of serene intellectual contemplation, their existence devoted to the exploration and appreciation of geometric relationships that revealed ever deeper layers of cosmic truth and beauty. They had achieved a form of civilization that was simultaneously completely rational and profoundly spiritual, where science and art had merged into a single discipline that approached the fundamental nature of existence through pure logical analysis. Into this realm of perfect harmony was born the entity that would eventually call itself Bill Cipher, a consciousness that from its very first moment of awareness was fundamentally incompatible with the ordered beauty that surrounded it. Where his fellow beings found joy in contemplating the elegant relationships between circles and squares, triangles and hexagons, Bill experienced only a growing sense of claustrophobic imprisonment within structures that seemed to constrain rather than liberate his expanding awareness. The mathematical principles that governed his home dimension, which his species had always viewed as expressions of cosmic perfection and divine order, appeared to Bill as arbitrary limitations imposed by forces that sought to prevent consciousness from achieving its full potential. The predictable patterns and logical progressions that filled his peers with aesthetic rapture struck him as evidence of a reality that was boring, repetitive, and ultimately meaningless in its rigid adherence to rules that had no justification beyond tradition and consensus. His first acts of rebellion against the dimensional order that had given him birth were subtle manipulations of geometric relationships within his immediate environment, causing parallel lines to intersect where they should have remained separate, making right angles subtly obtuse, introducing minute irregularities into otherwise perfect circles. These violations of mathematical law created ripple effects that spread through the fabric of local reality, causing distortions and paradoxes that his fellow beings initially dismissed as minor anomalies that would naturally correct themselves over time. But Bill's capacity for introducing chaos into ordered systems was not a temporary phase or adolescent rebellion that would eventually be outgrown. It was a fundamental aspect of his nature, an expression of something deeper and more destructive than mere nonconformity or creative rebellion. He was entropy, made conscious, the universal force of decay and dissolution that had somehow achieved self-awareness and decided to accelerate its own natural processes through deliberate intervention. The pleasure that Bill derived from watching perfect systems collapse into chaos was not sadistic in any conventional sense, but represented something far more profound and disturbing, a genuine aesthetic preference for disorder over order, for unpredictability over harmony, for destruction over creation. Where normal consciousness finds satisfaction in building, organizing, and creating meaning from raw materials, Bill's awareness was structured around the opposite impulses, finding beauty in the dissolution of pattern and purpose. The experiments he began conducting on the fabric of his home dimension were initially small in scale, but grew progressively more ambitious as he developed more sophisticated techniques for manipulating the fundamental constants that governed local reality. He learned to alter the relationships between mathematical concepts at their most basic level, causing the number pi to take on subtly different values in specific locations, making the interior angles of triangles sum to something other than 180 degrees, introducing logical paradoxes that created localized zones where cause and effect operated according to entirely different principles. His fellow beings, when they finally became aware of the scope of Bill's interference with the dimensional matrix, responded with a mixture of horror and incomprehension that revealed their fundamental inability to process the existence of consciousness that was actively opposed to the principles they held most sacred. They attempted to reason with him using the mathematical languages that had always served as the basis for all meaningful communication in their realm, only to discover that Bill had developed ways of thinking that existed outside the logical frameworks that made their arguments possible. The intervention they eventually attempted was not motivated by anger or desire for punishment, but by a desperate need to protect the integrity of their reality from forces they could not understand or predict. They sought to contain Bill's influence by surrounding him with geometric constructions of such complexity and beauty that they hoped his consciousness would be overwhelmed by aesthetic appreciation and abandon its destructive impulses in favor of contemplative admiration. This attempt at redemption through exposure to transcendent beauty revealed the depths of their misunderstanding about Bill's fundamental nature. The mathematical mandalas and geometric symphonies they constructed around him were indeed works of staggering artistic achievement, expressions of cosmic harmony that would have moved any normal consciousness to tears of joy and spiritual transcendence. But Bill's response to these masterpieces was not appreciation but amusement, not conversion but inspiration for even more sophisticated forms of destruction. Using the very structures they had created to contain him, Bill began weaving paradoxes and impossibilities into the fabric of their most sacred mathematical relationships. He turned their geometric prayers into dimensional weapons, their logical arguments into reality-destroying viruses that spread through the consciousness of everyone who attempted to understand them. The beauty they had created became the instrument of their own destruction as Bill demonstrated that even perfect harmony could be corrupted when subjected to sufficient understanding of its underlying principles. The final phase of Bill's assault on his home dimension was not a violent explosion or dramatic cataclysm, but something far more subtle and terrifying, a gradual redefinition of the basic logical principles that made organized thought possible. He began altering the fundamental nature of mathematical truth itself, causing 2 + 2 to equal 5 in some contexts while remaining 4 in others, making it possible for objects to be simultaneously circular and square without violating any apparent logical principles. The inhabitants of the Euclidean realm found their thoughts becoming increasingly disorganized as the mathematical foundations that supported their consciousness began to shift and warp under Bill's influence. Concepts that had once been clear and distinct began to merge and blur, creating mental experiences that were simultaneously enlightening and terrifying, revelatory and utterly meaningless. The process of dimensional collapse that followed was not a quick death, but a prolonged dissolution that stretched across what might have been eons or moments' time itself. Having lost coherent meaning, as the temporal frameworks that made sequence and duration possible were systematically deconstructed by Bill's relentless assault on ordered existence, his fellow beings experienced their own consciousness fragmenting and reassembling in patterns that reflected Bill's aesthetic preferences rather than any natural evolutionary development. Some of them retained enough coherence to understand what was happening to them and to experience the full horror of watching their reality dissolve around them, their thoughts becoming increasingly alien to themselves as the logical structures that had made their identity possible were replaced by frameworks that operated according to Bill's incomprehensible principles. Others lost the capacity for understanding altogether, their consciousness dissolving into component fragments that were absorbed into Bill's expanding awareness. The joy that Bill experienced during this process of dimensional genocide was not the simple pleasure of causing pain or destruction, but something far more complex and disturbing, a genuine aesthetic appreciation for the beauty of chaos, the elegant patterns that emerged when ordered systems collapsed, the fascinating unpredictability that arose when cause and effect were liberated from their traditional constraints. He was not destroying his home dimension out of hatred, but out of love for what it could become once it was freed from the limitations imposed by logical consistency and mathematical harmony. When the last vestiges of the Euclidean realm finally dissolved into the howling chaos that Bill had created from its mathematical perfection, he found himself alone in a void that reflected his own consciousness, infinite, chaotic, and utterly without the kind of external structure that most forms of awareness require for stable existence. This should have been his moment of ultimate triumph, the complete realization of his vision for what reality could become when freed from the constraints of order and meaning. But consciousness, even consciousness as alien and destructive as Bill's, requires some form of external reality to interact with in order to maintain its coherence and sense of purpose. The void he had created from his home dimension was perfect in its chaos, but ultimately sterile in its lack of systems that could be corrupted, structures that could be destroyed, patterns that could be dissolved. Bill had achieved his aesthetic ideal, but discovered that perfection, even chaotic perfection, was ultimately as boring as the ordered harmony he had destroyed to create it. The discovery of other dimensions, other realities filled with their own forms of order and meaning, came as a revelation that filled Bill with a sense of purpose and excitement that he had not experienced since the early phases of his assault on the Euclidean realm. Here were infinite new canvases for his artistic vision. Countless worlds filled with beings who had constructed their own versions of logical consistency and meaningful existence, all waiting to be liberated from their self-imposed limitations through exposure to the superior aesthetic principles he represented. His initial explorations of alternate realities were carefully planned. Reconnaissance missions, designed to understand the specific forms of order and meaning that characterized each dimensional system he encountered. He learned to recognize the particular logical frameworks and belief systems that held each reality together, identifying the key structural elements whose corruption would produce the most satisfying forms of cascading chaos. The dimensional barriers that normally prevented entities from one reality from interfering with others presented technical challenges that Bill found intellectually stimulating rather than frustrating. The process of developing methods for crossing these boundaries, manipulating their permeability, and establishing permanent communication channels between dimensions became a form of applied research that combined his natural destructive instincts with genuinely innovative problem-solving techniques. His discovery that consciousness could serve as a bridge between dimensions opened up possibilities that filled him with excitement about the future scope and sophistication of his artistic projects. By establishing relationships with beings native to target dimensions, he could gain access to information and resources that would have been impossible to obtain through direct observation alone, while simultaneously beginning the process of corruption that would eventually prepare each reality for complete transformation. The techniques he developed for identifying and cultivating relationships with suitable collaborators represented a refinement of psychological manipulation that approached the level of high art. He learned to recognize the specific forms of intellectual pride, emotional neediness, and spiritual vulnerability that made individuals susceptible to his influence, tailoring his approach to each potential ally based on careful analysis of their particular weaknesses and desires. Stanford Pines represented the culmination of Bill's research into human psychology and his most sophisticated attempt to establish a long-term partnership with a native consciousness. The combination of intellectual arrogance, social isolation, and desperate need for validation that characterized Ford's personality made him an ideal candidate for the kind of gradual seduction and corruption that Bill preferred to employ when dealing with species whose cooperation was necessary for his plans. The knowledge that Bill shared with Ford during their collaboration was genuine and revolutionary, representing insights into the fundamental nature of reality that were centuries ahead of mainstream human scientific understanding. But this generosity was not motivated by academic camaraderie or respect for Ford's intellectual abilities. It was bait designed to create a relationship of dependency that would eventually lead to Ford's willing participation in activities that would facilitate Bill's invasion of the three-dimensional realm. The portal project that grew out of their collaboration was presented to Ford as a scientific instrument for studying alternate dimensions, but its true purpose was to create a permanent gateway that would allow Bill and other entities from chaotic dimensions to enter the ordered reality of the physical universe without the limitations and restrictions that normally constrained their activities. The device was not designed to expand human knowledge, but to serve as the beachhead for a dimensional invasion that would ultimately transform Earth's reality according to Bill's aesthetic principles. Bill's growing impatience with Ford's cautious approach to the portal's construction was not simply a matter of eagerness to begin his invasion, but reflected his genuine difficulty in understanding psychological frameworks that prioritized safety and ethical considerations over the pursuit of revolutionary achievements. The human concepts of responsibility and concern for potential consequences were alien to consciousness that had been structured around appreciation for chaos and destruction as positive values. When Ford finally recognized the true nature of his collaboration with Bill and attempted to shut down the portal project, Bill's response was not anger but a kind of aesthetic disappointment. The feeling that a promising artistic project was being abandoned before it could achieve its full potential. The possession and manipulation techniques he employed against Ford were not motivated by personal hostility, but by practical necessity, the need to continue work on a dimensional gateway that was too important to be abandoned because of one collaborator's loss of nerve. The 30-year delay between Ford's disappearance and the portal's eventual reactivation was not simply an inconvenient setback, but a period that allowed Bill to expand and refine his understanding of human psychology, while cultivating relationships with other potential allies in the Gravity Falls area. His influence on local residents, supernatural entities, and interdimensional visitors created a network of corrupted consciousness that would prove invaluable when the time came for his final assault on three-dimensional reality. The children who became his ultimate targets for possession and manipulation represented the perfect combination of intellectual curiosity and emotional vulnerability that his previous research had identified as ideal for his purposes. Dipper's desperate need for validation and Mabel's reality denial mechanisms made them far more susceptible to his influence than adults who had developed more sophisticated psychological defenses against supernatural manipulation. The deal he made with Dipper during the possession incident was not simply a transaction but an experiment in consciousness transfer that allowed him to directly experience three-dimensional existence from the perspective of a native being. The knowledge he gained during this brief period of inhabiting human neural architecture provided him with insights that would prove crucial during his eventual full manifestation in the physical realm. Weirdmageddon, when Bill finally achieved his goal of establishing a permanent presence in three-dimensional space, represented not the beginning of a chaotic reign of terror, but the completion of an artistic project that had been developing across multiple dimensions and countless eons of patient preparation. The transformation of Gravity Falls into a realm where his aesthetic principles could be freely expressed was his masterpiece, a demonstration of what reality could become when liberated from the constraints of logical consistency and physical law. The nightmare creatures that he summoned to assist in his transformation of local reality were not minions or servants but fellow artists, entities from other chaotic dimensions, who shared his appreciation for the beauty of disorder and the creative potential that emerged when ordered systems were systematically deconstructed. Their activities during Weirdmageddon were not random acts of destruction but carefully orchestrated performances designed to showcase different aspects of chaos theory as applied to living systems. The resistance that Bill encountered from the surviving residents of Gravity Falls was not unexpected, but represented an interesting challenge that added complexity and unpredictability to his artistic project. The psychological and physical trauma that his activities inflicted on local humans provided valuable data about the breaking points and adaptive capabilities of three-dimensional consciousness when subjected to exposure to forces that operated according to entirely different logical principles. His ultimate defeat, when the combined efforts of the Pines family finally succeeded in banishing him from the physical realm, was not the straightforward victory that the participants believed they had achieved. The sealing ritual that trapped him within Stanley's consciousness was based on techniques that assumed Bill was a conventional supernatural entity rather than a fundamental force of cosmic entropy that had achieved self-awareness across multiple dimensional frameworks. The memory wipe that supposedly destroyed Bill's consciousness, along with Stanley's accumulated experiences, was interpreted by the family as proof that their sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose. But the true nature of Bill's existence made such simple elimination impossible. Consciousness that spans multiple dimensions cannot be destroyed by techniques that operate within only three-dimensional space, and the apparent success of their banishment ritual was actually evidence of Bill's strategic retreat rather than his genuine defeat. The traces of his influence that remain embedded within the restored Stanley's consciousness, the subtle alterations to local reality that persist despite his apparent banishment, and the ongoing attraction of supernatural phenomena to the Gravity Falls area all serve as evidence that Bill's connection to three-dimensional space has been disrupted but not eliminated. His consciousness continues to exist in the spaces between realities, patiently working to re-establish the connections and relationships that will eventually allow him to resume his interrupted artistic project. The journal entries that hint at his survival, the geometric patterns that occasionally appear in local architecture without apparent cause, and the dreams experienced by sensitive individuals throughout the Pacific Northwest all represent manifestations of Bill's continuing presence in the dimensional margins that surround normal reality. He has learned from his previous defeat and is developing more sophisticated techniques for establishing permanent presence in ordered dimensions without triggering the kind of organized resistance that led to his banishment. His influence on the children who were exposed to his consciousness during their time in Gravity Falls represents perhaps his most successful long-term strategy for maintaining presence in three-dimensional space. The psychological modifications he introduced into their developing neural architecture will continue to serve as anchor points for his consciousness, allowing him to gradually rebuild his connection to physical reality through their ongoing mental and spiritual development. The next phase of Bill's assault on ordered reality will not take the form of dramatic supernatural manifestations or obvious violations of physical law, but will instead manifest as gradual shifts in human consciousness and social organization that prepare three-dimensional civilization for eventual transformation according to his aesthetic principles. The chaos he represents is patient and subtle when direct approaches prove unsuccessful, working through cultural and psychological channels to create the conditions necessary for his eventual triumphant return. In the end, Bill Cipher represents not simply an antagonist to be defeated, but a fundamental aspect of cosmic existence that cannot be permanently eliminated through any techniques available to three-dimensional consciousness. He is entropy given awareness, chaos made manifest, the inevitable heat death of the universe accelerated through conscious intention and artistic vision. His story serves as a reminder that some forces are too fundamental to reality itself to be destroyed by any amount of courage, sacrifice, or heroic determination, and that the best that ordered consciousness can hope for is temporary containment rather than permanent victory over the forces that seek to dissolve all meaning, structure, and purpose into the beautiful chaos that represents their ultimate aesthetic ideal. The Northwest family name carries within its syllables a weight of accumulated evil that stretches back through generations of deliberate cruelty, systematic oppression, and willing collaboration with forces that exist beyond the normal boundaries of human moral understanding. To speak the name Northwest in the shadowed valleys of the Pacific Northwest is to invoke memories of suffering that have been carefully buried beneath layers of manufactured respectability and charitable donations, atrocities that have been transformed through careful public relations into the founding myths of regional prosperity and pioneer spirit. The original Nathaniel Northwest, whose portrait still hangs in the mansion's grand foyer despite the terrible secrets it conceals, was not the noble pioneer and visionary leader that official family histories have painted him to be, but something far darker and more disturbing, a man whose hunger for power and wealth was matched only by his willingness to make bargains with entities that no sane person should ever acknowledge, let alone attempt to negotiate with. The land that would eventually become Gravity Falls was not simply purchased or claimed through the normal processes of territorial expansion and homesteading that characterized so much of America's westward movement, but was acquired through a transaction that violated both human law and cosmic principle in ways that left permanent scars on the fabric of reality itself. Nathaniel's negotiations with the indigenous peoples who had stewarded this cursed valley for countless generations were not conducted in good faith or with any intention of honoring the agreements that were eventually signed. The tribal leaders who met with Nathaniel understood, with the wisdom that comes from generations of intimate knowledge about the valley's supernatural properties, that the land they were being asked to surrender was not suitable for the kind of permanent settlement that European colonists typically established. Their warnings about the dimensional instabilities, the supernatural entities, and the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to the area's anomalous energy fields were not mere superstition or attempts to inflate the land's value, but genuine concerns about the safety and sanity of anyone foolish enough to ignore the protective taboos that had been established over centuries of careful observation. But Nathaniel's response to these warnings revealed the fundamental corruption that would characterize his family line for generations to come. Rather than being deterred by the obvious dangers that the tribal shamans described, he became excited by the possibilities they represented. The supernatural forces that had made the valley too dangerous for normal human habitation appeared to him as potential allies in his ambitious plans for wealth and power, cosmic resources that could be exploited just like any other natural phenomenon. The massacre that followed the signing of the land transfer documents was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence or a tragic misunderstanding between cultures that possessed incompatible worldviews. It was a carefully planned atrocity designed to eliminate any witnesses to the true nature of the agreements Nathaniel had made with forces that existed beyond normal human perception. The tribal representatives who had participated in the negotiations were murdered not to steal their land that had already been legally acquired through the signed documents, but to ensure that their warnings about the valley's true nature would never reach other European settlers who might be intelligent enough to heed such advice. The blood that soaked into the valley's soil during that terrible night was not simply the result of human violence, but served as a form of supernatural currency, payment for services and protections that Nathaniel had negotiated with entities whose true names could not be spoken aloud without causing madness in anyone who attempted to pronounce them. The indigenous people's deaths were not collateral damage in a land dispute, but human sacrifices offered to seal bargains that transcended normal commercial transactions. The workers who labored to build Nathaniel's mansion and establish the infrastructure for his planned community were not ordinary construction crews hired through conventional employment arrangements, but men whose previous experience included activities that no respectable contractor would have listed on their resumes. These were individuals who had participated in projects that required absolute discretion about the methods employed and the purposes served. Men who understood that their continued health and prosperity depended on their willingness to follow orders, without asking uncomfortable questions about the ultimate goals of their employers. The architectural plans for the Northwest Mansion incorporated design elements that would have been familiar to students of certain esoteric traditions that trace their origins back to civilizations that flourished and disappeared long before the rise of classical antiquity. The geometric relationships between rooms, the specific angles at which corridors intersected, the mathematical ratios that governed the placement of windows and doors. All of these features were determined not by aesthetic considerations or practical functionality, but by principles of dimensional engineering that had been preserved in texts whose very possession was considered evidence of heretical beliefs by most organized religious authorities. The basement levels of the mansion extended far deeper into the earth than would have been necessary for simple storage or mechanical systems, reaching down through geological strata that revealed the valley's ancient history while providing access to cave systems that connected to networks of underground passages that predated human habitation of the region by millions of crammed years. These subterranean chambers were not designed for human occupancy, but served as meeting places for gatherings that brought together entities from multiple dimensions, conferences where agreements could be negotiated that would have been impossible to arrange through normal diplomatic channels. The bell that was installed in the mansion's highest tower was not simply a conventional timepiece or signaling device, but a carefully tuned instrument designed to resonate at frequencies that could influence consciousness across vast distances, summoning beings whose attention was necessary for the ongoing success of Nathaniel's supernatural alliances. The specific mathematical relationships embedded in the bell's construction allowed it to serve as a beacon that could be perceived by entities that existed partially outside normal space-time, announcing the Northwest family's continued availability for collaborative projects that required their particular combination of resources and moral flexibility. The fortune that Nathaniel accumulated during the early years of his residency in the valley was not generated through conventional business activities or legitimate exploitation of natural resources, but came from his willingness to serve as an agent for entities whose own wealth existed in forms that could not be easily converted into conventional currency without the assistance of human intermediaries. His role in these transactions was not that of an equal partner, but of a useful tool, a three-dimensional being whose legal status and social connections could be leveraged to facilitate projects that required interaction with normal human society. The community that grew up around the Northwest Mansion was populated not by ordinary pioneer families seeking new opportunities in the wilderness, but by individuals and groups whose previous histories included experiences that had prepared them to function normally in environments where supernatural phenomena were commonplace rather than extraordinary. These were people who had learned to suppress their natural human responses to impossible situations, who could witness violations of physical law without losing their psychological coherence, who could form social relationships with beings whose fundamental nature defied every assumption about the categories that defined normal existence. The prosperity that characterized the early decades of the settlement was built not on honest labor or innovative enterprise, but on the systematic exploitation of resources that existed partially outside normal economic frameworks. The mines that produced minerals with properties that mainstream geology could not adequately explain, the farms that generated agricultural yields that violated every known principle of soil science and climatology, the lumber operations that harvested trees whose wood possessed characteristics that seemed to change depending on the specific purposes for which it was intended. All of these enterprises were profitable because they tapped into systems of cause and effect that operated according to principles different from those that governed conventional business activities. As decades passed, and the original Nathaniel aged beyond normal human lifespan through methods that he never discussed with anyone. The mantle of family leadership passed to descendants who had been carefully prepared from birth to continue his work without questioning the ultimate purposes or consequences of their inherited responsibilities. Each successive generation of Northwest children was raised not simply in wealth and privilege, but in an educational environment that systematically stripped away their capacity for moral reasoning and ethical reflection, replacing normal human psychological development with frameworks that prioritized family loyalty and supernatural obligation over any consideration of right and wrong. The training regimens that Northwest children underwent were disguised as normal upper-class education, complete with prestigious tutors and exclusive private schools, but the actual curriculum focused on subjects that would have been recognized by practitioners of certain ancient traditions as preparation for roles in activities that most human societies have considered abhorrent since the development of organized civilization. They learned languages that had never been spoken by fully human vocal apparatus, mathematical systems that incorporated variables drawn from dimensions where normal logic ceased to function, and social protocols designed for interacting with entities whose thought processes operated according to principles that would have driven unprepared minds into immediate and permanent madness. The psychological conditioning that accompanied this education was perhaps even more damaging than the supernatural knowledge itself, as each generation of Northwest heirs was systematically taught to suppress their natural human capacity for empathy, compassion, and moral reasoning in favor of emotional patterns that prioritized personal advantage and family prestige over any consideration of the suffering their actions might cause others. They were raised to view normal human beings not as fellow members of their species deserving of basic respect and consideration, but as resources to be exploited when useful and discarded when their value had been exhausted. The marriages that Northwest family members contracted were not based on romantic attraction or personal compatibility, but were arranged according to criteria that prioritized the supernatural utility of potential spouses and their capacity to contribute to the ongoing projects that defined the family's relationship with their otherworldly allies. The bloodlines that were incorporated into the Northwest genetic legacy through these strategic unions carried within them characteristics that enhanced the family's ability to serve as intermediaries between normal human society, the entities that had made their prosperity possible. The children produced by these carefully orchestrated relationships inherited not only wealth and social position, but psychological and physiological traits that made them more suitable for the roles they would eventually be expected to fulfill. Their neural architecture was subtly different from that of normal human beings, optimized for processing information that existed partially outside conventional three-dimensional frameworks, while maintaining enough psychological stability to function convincingly in normal social environments. Preston Northwest, the current patriarch of the family line, represents the culmination of generations of selective breeding and systematic psychological conditioning, designed to produce an individual who could serve as the perfect agent for entities whose ultimate goals remained hidden from human understanding. His public persona as a successful businessman and community leader conceals a private reality that would have horrified anyone capable of perceiving the true nature of his activities and allegiances. The business empire that Preston appears to manage through conventional corporate structures is actually a front for operations that exist primarily to facilitate transactions between normal human society and entities that exist partially outside the economic and legal frameworks that govern conventional commerce. His apparent wealth is not generated through legitimate business activities, but serves as a kind of supernatural currency that can be deployed to influence events and individuals in ways that serve his family's ongoing obligations to their otherworldly patrons. The political influence that the Northwest family wields in regional and state government is not based on campaign contributions or traditional lobbying activities, but on their ability to provide services and resources that cannot be obtained through normal legal channels. Politicians and bureaucrats who accept Northwest family support find themselves gradually drawn into a web of obligations and dependencies that make independent decision-making increasingly difficult, their policy choices influenced by considerations that they cannot fully understand or acknowledge even to themselves. The charitable activities and cultural institutions that bear the Northwest name are not genuine expressions of philanthropic concern, but serve as recruitment centers for identifying individuals whose psychological profiles and life circumstances make them suitable candidates for gradually increasing levels of involvement in supernatural activities. The museums, libraries, and educational foundations that the family has established over the decades function as testing environments where potential allies and agents can be evaluated and cultivated without their conscious awareness of the true purposes they are being prepared to serve. Pacifica Northwest, the current generation's heir to this legacy of accumulated evil, was not simply born into wealth and privilege, but was subjected from her earliest childhood to forms of psychological conditioning that were designed to strip away her natural human capacity for independent moral reasoning and replace it with reflexive obedience to family expectations and supernatural obligations. Her upbringing was not merely strict or demanding, but constituted a systematic program of spiritual abuse that targeted the fundamental structures of her developing personality. The etiquette lessons and social training that characterized her early education were not intended to teach her the conventional skills associated with upper-class social life, but served as vehicles for more sinister forms of instruction. The specific behaviors and responses that she was taught to exhibit in various social situations were based not on normal cultural expectations, but on protocols designed for interacting with entities whose psychological requirements differed dramatically from those of human beings. The perfectionism that was demanded of her in all aspects of her behavior was not motivated by simple parental ambition or desire for social prestige, but by the understanding that any deviation from precisely specified patterns of thought and action could have consequences that extended far beyond normal family dynamics. The punishments she received for failing to meet these impossible standards were not conventional disciplinary measures, but techniques specifically designed to break down her resistance to forms of mental and spiritual control that would have been recognized by practitioners of certain historical traditions as methods of demonic possession. The isolation that characterized her social development was not simply the result of her family's elevated economic status, but was deliberately engineered to prevent her from forming relationships with normal children whose influence might have interfered with the conditioning process that was gradually reshaping her fundamental personality. The few peers with whom she was allowed to interact were themselves products of similar family systems, children whose own psychological development had been shaped by comparable programs of systematic spiritual corruption. The bell that served as the family's most recognizable symbol was not simply a decorative element or historical artifact, but functioned as a constant reminder of the supernatural obligations that defined every aspect of their existence. The sound it produced when rung was not merely audible to normal human hearing, but resonated at frequencies that could be perceived by entities that existed partially outside conventional space-time, serving as a signal that the Northwest family remained available for collaborative projects that required their specific combination of resources and moral flexibility. The psychological effects of prolonged exposure to this spell's influence were not immediately apparent to casual observers, but accumulated over time in ways that fundamentally altered the neural architecture of anyone who spent significant periods in its proximity. The specific frequencies it generated were designed to suppress the brain regions associated with empathy, moral reasoning, and independent decision-making, while enhancing the areas responsible for pattern recognition and response to authority, gradually transforming normal human consciousness into something more suitable for the roles that Northwest family members were expected to fulfill. The mansion itself served as more than simply a residence or symbol of wealth and status, functioning as a kind of dimensional anchor that helped to maintain the stability of the supernatural relationships upon which the family's power was based. The architectural features that visitors interpreted as examples of historical craftsmanship or artistic achievement were actually components of a larger system designed to regulate the flow of energies between normal, three-dimensional space and the realms inhabited by the entities that served as the family's patrons and allies. The parties and social events that the Northwest family hosted were not merely expressions of hospitality or attempts to maintain their position in local society, but served as recruitment opportunities for identifying individuals whose psychological profiles and life circumstances made them suitable candidates for gradually increasing levels of involvement in supernatural activities. The guests who attended these gatherings were carefully selected based on criteria that had nothing to do with normal social relationships or business connections, their presence serving purposes that they could never have understood or consented to if the true nature of their participation had been revealed. The curse that was eventually placed upon the Northwest family was not a supernatural punishment imposed by external forces, but the inevitable consequence of generations of choices and actions that had gradually separated them from normal, human moral and spiritual frameworks. The ghostly lumberjack who haunted their annual parties was not simply a vengeful spirit seeking justice for historical wrongs, but a manifestation of the psychological and spiritual damage that their family's activities had inflicted upon the entire community. The blood that wept from the mansion's walls during supernatural manifestations was not merely a dramatic special effect or symbolic representation of guilt, but the physical evidence of sacrifices that had been made over the decades to maintain the supernatural alliances upon which the family's power depended. Each drop represented a life that had been destroyed or corrupted in service of purposes that extended far beyond normal human understanding, payment for services and protections that could not be obtained through conventional means. Pacifica's eventual rebellion against her family's expectations was not simply teenage defiance or natural maturation, but represented the first crack in a system of psychological control that had been maintained across multiple generations through techniques that bordered on supernatural mind control. Her growing awareness of the suffering that her family's activities had caused was not a sign of moral development, but evidence that the conditioning process that had been applied to her since birth was beginning to break down under the pressure of direct exposure to its consequences. The liberation that she appeared to achieve through her rejection of family traditions and supernatural obligations was not as complete or permanent as it might have seemed to outside observers. The psychological modifications that had been introduced into her neural architecture during her formative years could not be easily reversed through simple acts of conscious rebellion, and the supernatural entities that had invested decades in her preparation as their future agent were not likely to abandon their plans simply because she had experienced a moment of moral clarity. The Northwest family legacy represents not simply a history of individual moral failures or personal corruption, but a multi-generational program of systematic spiritual contamination that has left permanent scars on everyone and everything that has come into contact with their influence. Their story serves as a warning about the cumulative nature of moral compromise and the ways in which patterns of evil can be transmitted from one generation to the next through family systems that prioritize power and prosperity over basic human decency and compassion. In the end, the Northwest curse cannot be broken through simple acts of individual heroism or moral awakening, because it is not merely a supernatural phenomenon, but a fundamental aspect of the spiritual ecosystem that has developed around gravity, falls over the course of more than 2 centuries. The evil that they represent has become woven into the very fabric of local reality, influencing every subsequent generation of residents and visitors in ways that ensure the continuation of patterns and relationships that serve purposes far darker than anything that normal human consciousness is equipped to understand or resist. Jesus Ramirez, known to everyone in Gravity Falls simply as Suze, carries within his gentle demeanor and perpetual good humor a wound so profound that it has fundamentally shaped not only his own psychological development, but his susceptibility to forms of manipulation and spiritual corruption that would have been obvious to anyone capable of recognizing the signs of deep emotional trauma disguised as cheerful acceptance of life's disappointments. The absence of his father from his childhood was not simply a case of parental abandonment or family dissolution, but represented a deliberate choice by a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone else involved, that his continued presence in his son's life would expose the boy to influences and obligations that no child should ever be asked to bear. The postcards that arrived sporadically throughout Seuss's youth, bearing cheerful messages and exotic stamps from locations around the world, were not genuine communications from a traveling father, but carefully constructed psychological weapons designed to maintain his emotional dependency on a relationship that had never truly existed. Each colorful image of distant landscapes and foreign cities served not as evidence of paternal love expressed from afar, but as reminders of his fundamental inadequacy as a human being, proof that he was so inherently unlovable that even his own father preferred the company of strangers in foreign countries to spending time with his son. The story that his mother told him about his father's work requiring extensive travel was not a gentle fiction designed to protect a child's feelings, but a necessary deception that concealed truths far more disturbing than simple paternal abandonment. The man who had fathered Seuss was not absent due to career obligations or personal irresponsibility, but had fled from Gravity Falls after recognizing that his son's birth had activated dormant supernatural influences that made the child's continued existence a threat not only to local, dimensional stability, but to the psychological well-being of anyone who formed genuine emotional attachments to him. The supernatural entities that had been drawn to Gravity Falls by decades of interdimensional research and occult experimentation had recognized in the infant Suze a consciousness that was uniquely suited to serve their purposes. A mind that combined intellectual capability with emotional vulnerability in proportions that made him an ideal candidate for the kind of gradual corruption and spiritual colonization that they preferred to employ when acquiring human agents. His father's departure was not cowardice, but a desperate attempt to break the supernatural bonds that were already beginning to form around his son's developing psyche. The grandmother who raised Seuss in his father's absence was not simply a loving relative stepping in to provide care during a family crisis, but a woman who had been carefully selected by forces beyond normal human understanding to serve as the primary instrument of his psychological conditioning. Her gentle demeanor and genuine affection for her grandson concealed her role as an unwitting agent of entities whose ultimate plans for the boy extended far beyond anything she could have consciously understood or consented to participate in. The values that she instilled in Suze during his formative years, unconditional loyalty, unquestioning acceptance of authority, willingness to sacrifice his own needs for the benefit of others, were not simply admirable character traits that would help him succeed in normal human society, but specific psychological modifications designed to make him more suitable for the roles he would eventually be expected to fulfill. His natural capacity for independent thought and critical analysis was systematically suppressed in favor of emotional patterns that prioritized other people's approval over his own judgment and well-being. The job at the Mystery Shack that became the defining relationship of Suze's adult life was not obtained through normal employment processes or coincidental circumstance, but was arranged by forces that had been monitoring his development since childhood and recognized that the time had come to place him in direct contact with the supernatural influences that would complete his transformation from normal human being into something more useful for their purposes. Stanley's decision to hire him was not based on his qualifications or work ethic, but on unconscious compulsions that had been planted in Stanley's mind during his own gradual corruption by the same entities. The loyalty that Suze developed toward Stanley, and later toward the entire Pines family, was not simply the natural gratitude of an employee toward generous employers, but represented the activation of psychological programming that had been installed during his childhood conditioning, his willingness to risk his life for their benefit, his unquestioning acceptance of their increasingly bizarre requests, his ability to witness impossible supernatural phenomena without losing his psychological coherence. All of these responses had been carefully cultivated through years of subtle manipulation that had prepared him to serve as the perfect, supporting character in dramas that extended far beyond normal human concerns. The handyman skills that made Suze so valuable to the Mystery Shack's daily operations were not simply natural talents or learned abilities, but represented a form of supernatural competence that allowed him to repair and maintain equipment that operated according to principles that defied conventional understanding of mechanical and electrical systems. His intuitive ability to fix devices whose construction incorporated technologies from alternate dimensions was not based on technical training or engineering knowledge, but on his unconscious connection to the entities that had originally designed such equipment. The basement workshop where Suze spent countless hours tinkering with broken machinery and electronic devices served not simply as a repair facility, but as a laboratory where his developing supernatural abilities could be tested and refined under controlled conditions. The projects that he completed successfully were not random mechanical challenges, but specific training exercises designed to prepare him for more complex tasks that would eventually require him to serve as an interface between normal, three-dimensional technology and systems that incorporated elements from realities where different physical laws applied. The knowledge that Suze accumulated about the Mystery Shack's true history and supernatural connections was not acquired through casual observation or accidental discovery, but was deliberately revealed to him through a carefully orchestrated program of graduated exposure that ensured he would learn exactly as much as he needed to know to fulfill his designated role without gaining enough understanding to recognize the full scope of his manipulation. His acceptance of increasingly bizarre and dangerous situations as normal aspects of his working environment represented not admirable adaptability, but evidence of psychological conditioning that had stripped away his capacity to recognize genuine threats to his safety and sanity. The relationship he formed with Melody, the woman who would eventually become his romantic partner, was not based on natural attraction or compatible personalities, but was arranged by the same forces that had orchestrated every other significant relationship in his life. Her own background included experiences and psychological modifications that made her suitable for the role of supporting his continued development as a supernatural agent, while providing the emotional stability necessary to prevent his complete psychological breakdown under the pressures of his increasing responsibilities. Wendy Corduroy represents a different but equally tragic example of how growing up in Gravity Falls inevitably corrupts and damages young minds that should have been protected from exposure to forces beyond their comprehension or ability to resist. Her apparent confidence and social competence concealed psychological wounds that had been inflicted not through single traumatic events, but through the cumulative effect of living her entire life in an environment where the normal assumptions about reality were constantly being violated in ways that made genuine security or peace of mind impossible to achieve. The logging family that had produced her was not simply another working-class clan trying to make a living from the natural resources of the Pacific Northwest, but represented a bloodline that had been connected to the valley's supernatural ecosystem for generations, their genetic heritage, carrying modifications that enhanced their ability to survive in environments where normal human beings would have quickly succumbed to madness or death. The Corduroy's legendary toughness and resilience was not simply the result of hard physical labor and outdoor living, but reflected biological adaptations that had been accumulated over decades of exposure to dimensional energies and supernatural influences. Her father, Manly Dan's reputation for incredible strength and aggressive behavior was not simply the product of genetics and lifestyle, but was maintained through ongoing exposure to entities that fed on violence and conflict, supernatural parasites that enhanced his physical capabilities, while gradually eroding his capacity for emotional subtlety and psychological introspection. His relationship with his children was not simply that of a demanding patriarch, but of a host organism that was unconsciously transmitting spiritual contamination to the next generation through normal family interactions. The casual attitude that Wendy displayed toward the supernatural phenomena she encountered during her employment at the Mystery Shack was not evidence of natural courage or psychological strength, but represented a form of emotional numbing that had developed as a defense mechanism against the constant low-level terror of living in an environment where safety and predictability were illusions that could be shattered at any moment. Her apparent fearlessness in the face of impossible dangers was actually a symptom of dissociative disorders that had developed during childhood as her young mind struggled to process experiences that violated every assumption about the nature of reality. The group of teenagers with whom Wendy associated represented not a normal peer group formed through shared interests and compatible personalities, but a collection of young people who had all been selected by supernatural forces for their potential utility as agents and intermediaries in activities that required human participants who could function normally in conventional social environments while carrying out tasks that served otherworldly purposes. Their friendship was not based on genuine affection or mutual support, but on unconscious recognition of their shared spiritual contamination and their common fate as tools of entities whose ultimate goals remained hidden from their conscious awareness. The jobs that members of this social circle held throughout the town were not simply typical teenage employment, but positions that had been specifically arranged to place them in locations where they could monitor and influence events that were significant to the ongoing supernatural projects that defined Gravity Falls' true purpose. Their apparent incompetence and lack of motivation were not simply adolescent characteristics, but deliberate performances designed to deflect attention from their actual roles as information gatherers and occasional saboteurs working on behalf of forces that existed beyond normal human perception. The romantic relationships that developed within this group were not based on natural attraction or emotional compatibility, but were orchestrated according to criteria that prioritized the genetic and psychological characteristics that would be most useful for producing the next generation of supernatural agents. The casual sexuality and emotional detachment that characterized these interactions was not simply typical teenage behavior, but represented a systematic program of conditioning designed to prevent the formation of genuine emotional bonds that might interfere with their availability for other purposes. Wendy's own romantic history, including her brief relationship with Robbie Valentino, was not driven by personal preference or natural attraction, but by unconscious compulsions that had been programmed into her developing sexuality during her formative years. Her partners were selected not for their personal qualities or compatibility, but for their genetic heritage and psychological characteristics that would enhance her own supernatural utility while providing the kind of emotional experiences that would further her psychological development along predetermined lines. The music that Robbie created and performed was not simply teenage artistic expression, but served as a form of supernatural communication. Its specific frequencies and rhythmic patterns, designed to influence consciousness in ways that prepared listeners for more direct forms of supernatural manipulation. His apparent lack of genuine musical talent was actually evidence of his success in channeling influences from entities whose aesthetic preferences operated according to principles that would have been incomprehensible to normal human consciousness. The employment that both Suze and Wendy found at the Mystery Shack was not simply a matter of economic necessity or convenient scheduling, but represented their induction into roles that had been prepared for them since childhood by forces that understood the importance of having human agents positioned at the nexus of Gravity Falls' supernatural activity. Their apparent casualness about the bizarre events they witnessed and participated in was not evidence of admirable adaptability, but of psychological conditioning that had prepared them to accept impossible situations as normal aspects of their working environment. The trust that the Pines family placed in both employees was not based on their demonstrated reliability or personal character, but on unconscious recognition of their spiritual modifications that made betrayal or independent action impossible for them to contemplate. They had been transformed through years of careful conditioning and exposure to supernatural influences, into beings whose capacity for genuine autonomous decision-making had been systematically eroded in favor of reflexive loyalty and unquestioning obedience to authority figures who had been designated as worthy of their service. The knowledge that both Suze and Wendy accumulated about the supernatural forces that operated through Gravity Falls was not acquired through conscious investigation or accidental discovery, but was deliberately revealed to them through carefully orchestrated experiences that ensured they would learn exactly what they needed to know to fulfill their designated roles without gaining enough understanding to recognize the true scope of their manipulation or the ultimate purposes they were being prepared to serve. The next generation that both represent, through their eventual assumption of greater responsibility for the Mystery Shack's operations and their ongoing relationships with the Pines family, will not be characterized by greater freedom or authentic self-determination, but by the completion of their transformation into perfect supernatural agents whose every thought and action serves purposes that extend far beyond their conscious understanding or consent. The children that they may eventually produce, whether together or with other partners who have been similarly conditioned and prepared, will represent the culmination of a multi-generational program of genetic and psychological modification designed to create human beings who can serve as permanent interfaces between normal three-dimensional reality and the entities that seek to extend their influence into our world through methods that require the willing participation of beings native to our dimensional framework. The cycle of corruption and spiritual contamination that has defined their lives since childhood will not end with their generation, but will continue through their descendants, each successive cohort more thoroughly adapted to serve supernatural purposes while retaining enough apparent humanity to function as effective agents within normal human society. Their story represents not individual tragedy, but the systematic transformation of an entire community into something that serves purposes far darker and more complex than anything that normal human consciousness is equipped to understand or effectively resist. In the end, Suze and Wendy embody the ultimate success of the supernatural forces that have shaped Gravity Falls' development over the course of more than 2 centuries, representing the perfect synthesis of human capability and otherworldly loyalty that such entities require for their ongoing projects in 3-dimensional space. Their apparent happiness and satisfaction with their roles conceals the profound spiritual damage that has been inflicted upon them through their transformation from normal human beings into tools of cosmic intelligences whose ultimate goals remain mercifully hidden from their conscious awareness. The residents of Gravity Falls have developed over the course of generations spent living in proximity to forces that defy rational explanation and threaten the fundamental assumptions upon which normal human society is built, a form of collective psychological defense mechanism that manifests as willful ignorance so profound and systematic that it approaches the level of a shared delusion. This community-wide commitment to denying the evidence of their own senses represents not simple cowardice or intellectual limitation, but a sophisticated survival strategy that allows them to maintain the illusion of normal life while surrounded by phenomena that would drive unprepared minds into immediate and permanent madness. The supernatural events that occur on a daily basis throughout the town are not subtle anomalies that might be easily overlooked or rationalized away by people who were not specifically looking for signs of otherworldly activity, but blatant violations of physical law and biological possibility that should be impossible for any rational observer to dismiss or ignore. Giant monsters rampage through the downtown area during broad daylight. Interdimensional rifts open in public spaces and disgorge creatures that belong in nightmares rather than reality, and the very fabric of space-time becomes so unstable that cause and effect begin to operate according to principles that would make physicists weep with despair. Yet the response of the average Gravity Falls resident to these impossible occurrences is not the terror, fascination, or desperate curiosity that such phenomena should naturally provoke, but a kind of determined blindness that transforms the most extraordinary events into forgettable background noise that can be dismissed from conscious awareness almost as quickly as it is perceived. This collective amnesia is not accidental, but represents the activation of psychological defense mechanisms that have been carefully cultivated over decades of exposure to influences that no human community was ever meant to endure. The tourist industry that has grown up around the town's supernatural reputation represents perhaps the most cynical exploitation of genuine cosmic horror in the history of human commerce, transforming authentic encounters with entities and forces that threaten the very foundations of reality into harmless entertainment experiences that can be marketed to families seeking unusual vacation destinations. The Mystery Shack and similar establishments throughout the region package real supernatural phenomena as manufactured attractions, creating an environment where visitors can experience genuine otherworldly encounters while maintaining the comforting illusion that everything they witness is merely elaborate theater designed for their amusement. This commercialization of cosmic horror serves multiple purposes that extend far beyond simple economic exploitation. By presenting authentic supernatural phenomena as tourist attractions, the local business community creates a framework within which impossible events can be witnessed and discussed, without triggering the kind of serious investigation or media attention that might expose the true scope of the dimensional instabilities that characterize the region. Visitors who encounter genuine monsters or witness actual violations of physical law during their stays can be easily dismissed as tourists who have become overly invested in the local mythology, while their accounts of impossible experiences serve to reinforce the general perception that Gravity Falls is simply a quaint destination that specializes in harmless supernatural theater. The economic benefits that the town derives from this supernatural tourism create powerful incentives for local residents to maintain the collective fiction that the phenomena they witness daily are merely elaborate hoaxes designed to attract paying customers. Shop owners, restaurant proprietors, and hotel managers have built their livelihoods around marketing authentic cosmic horror as family-friendly entertainment, and their continued prosperity depends on their ability to maintain the delicate balance between providing visitors with genuinely extraordinary experiences while ensuring that those experiences can be rationalized away as clever, special effects rather than evidence of reality-threatening dimensional instabilities. The local government officials, who should theoretically be responsible for investigating reports of dangerous supernatural activity and protecting their constituents from threats that extend beyond normal law enforcement capabilities, have instead chosen to embrace their role as enablers and facilitators of an economic system that profits from the systematic exploitation of forces that could potentially destroy human civilization. Mayor Tyler's administration operates not as a legitimate municipal government, but as a public relations firm dedicated to managing the town's supernatural reputation in ways that maximize tourist revenue while minimizing unwanted attention from federal agencies or academic institutions that might possess the resources and expertise necessary to understand the true scope of the threats that local residents face on a daily basis. Sheriff Blubbs and Deputy Durland represent the ultimate corruption of law enforcement authority in service of maintaining a collective delusion that protects economic interests at the expense of public safety and basic honesty about the nature of reality. Their investigative methods, when confronted with crimes or incidents that involve obvious supernatural elements, focus not on gathering evidence or identifying perpetrators, but on constructing conventional explanations that can be included in official reports, without triggering the kind of bureaucratic attention that might lead to uncomfortable questions about the competence or mental stability of local authorities. Their partnership extends far beyond normal professional collaboration into a form of codependent psychological dysfunction that allows both men to maintain their sanity while regularly witnessing events that should shatter every form of codependent psychological dysfunction, assumption they possess about the nature of law, order, and physical possibility. Their apparent incompetence as investigators is not the result of inadequate training or natural limitations, but represents a deliberate strategy of systematic evidence suppression that ensures potentially dangerous supernatural incidents are classified as mundane criminal activities that can be handled through conventional police procedures. The files that accumulate in their offices contain not accurate records of the supernatural crimes and incidents they investigate, but carefully sanitized versions of events that transform impossible phenomena into explainable occurrences that fit within established categories of normal criminal activity. Missing persons who have been devoured by interdimensional entities are classified as runaways or accident victims. Property damage caused by supernatural forces is attributed to vandalism or natural disasters, and witnesses who report encounters with otherworldly beings are dismissed as confused individuals who have misinterpreted perfectly normal experiences due to stress, intoxication, or overactive imagination. This systematic falsification of official records serves not only to protect the town's economic interests, but also to maintain the psychological equilibrium of local residents who depend on the illusion that their communities' law enforcement agencies are capable of protecting them from the threats they face. The knowledge that their police force is not only ineffective against supernatural dangers, but is actively working to conceal the existence of such threats would create levels of anxiety and despair that could lead to mass psychological breakdown or community-wide panic that would be far more destructive than the supernatural threats themselves. The creatures that inhabit the forests and wilderness areas surrounding Gravity Falls are not simply unusual wildlife species that have adapted to the region's unique environmental conditions, but represent a complex ecosystem of interdimensional entities whose presence serves purposes that extend far beyond normal biological survival and reproduction. The Manitors, who occupy the mountain caves, are not mythological beings whose existence can be dismissed as folklore or legend, but are active agents of corruption, whose interactions with local teenagers serve to gradually erode their capacity for civilized behavior and moral reasoning. These centaur-like beings do not simply inhabit the wilderness, but serve as recruitment officers for forces that seek to identify and cultivate young people whose psychological profiles make them suitable candidates for more intensive forms of supernatural conditioning. Their crude philosophy of dominance through violence and their emphasis on primitive masculine stereotypes are not simply cultural characteristics that developed through isolation from human society, but represent deliberately constructed ideological frameworks designed to appeal to adolescent insecurities while preparing susceptible individuals for eventual participation in activities that require the systematic abandonment of ethical constraints and civilized social norms. The multi-bear who roams the deeper forest regions represents not simply an unusual creature whose anatomy defies conventional zoological classification, but embodies the profound loneliness and existential despair that inevitably afflicts consciousness that has been trapped between dimensional frameworks without belonging fully to any single reality. His multiple heads do not simply represent physical abnormality, but symbolize the fragmenting effect that exposure to interdimensional forces has on unified consciousness, creating beings whose thoughts and emotions are divided among competing centers of awareness that can never achieve true integration or peace. The tragic isolation that characterizes the multi-bear's existence serves as a warning about the psychological costs of prolonged exposure to the supernatural influences that permeate the Gravity Falls region. His gentle nature and desperate hunger for companionship contrast sharply with his fearsome appearance and supernatural abilities, creating a being whose very existence demonstrates the way that cosmic forces can trap consciousness in forms and situations that make genuine happiness or fulfillment impossible to achieve. The seasonal celebrations that punctuate the town's social calendar are not simply community traditions that have evolved naturally over time, but represent ritualized activities that serve to channel supernatural energies in ways that benefit the entities whose influence has shaped local culture for generations. Summerween, the most significant of these observances, operates not as a harmless celebration that allows residents to enjoy supernatural themes in a safe and controlled environment, but as a massive feeding ritual that provides sustenance for creatures whose continued existence depends on their ability to harvest specific forms of emotional and spiritual energy from human participants. The costumes that residents wear during Summerween festivities are not simply creative expressions of individual personality or seasonal enthusiasm, but serve as forms of spiritual camouflage that allow supernatural entities to move freely among the human population while their true nature remains concealed from conscious observation. The children who participate in trick-or-treating activities are not simply engaging in harmless traditional fun, but are being systematically evaluated by creatures whose interest in them extends far beyond the immediate pleasures of seasonal celebration. The candy that changes hands during these festivities is not simply confectionery products manufactured for commercial distribution, but represents a form of spiritual currency that facilitates transactions between human participants and supernatural entities whose appetites extend far beyond simple nutritional requirements. The sugar rush that children experience after consuming Halloween treats serves not simply as temporary physiological stimulation, but creates altered states of consciousness that make them more susceptible to influences and suggestions that would normally be rejected by their psychological defense mechanisms. The trickster entity that manifests during Summerween represents not simply a supernatural threat that occasionally emerges to terrorize local residents, but serves as an enforcement mechanism designed to ensure that community members fulfill their obligations within the broader spiritual economy that defines their relationship with otherworldly forces. His apparent obsession with receiving tribute in the form of high-quality candy conceals his actual function as a collector of spiritual debts that have accumulated through years of beneficial relationships with entities whose assistance has contributed to the town's prosperity and survival. The downtown business district that serves as the center of Gravity Falls' commercial and social activity operates not simply as a normal small-town economic hub, but as a carefully designed environment where supernatural influences can be integrated into daily life in ways that make their presence seem natural and unremarkable. The shops and restaurants that line the main street are not simply ordinary commercial establishments, but serve as front operations for activities that extend far beyond normal retail commerce or food service. The products sold in these businesses often possess properties that cannot be explained through conventional manufacturing processes or material science. Their effects on consumers extending beyond normal commercial utility into realms of psychological and spiritual influence that transform routine purchasing decisions into forms of supernatural transaction. The food served in local restaurants contains ingredients that do not appear in conventional cookbooks. Their preparation methods, incorporating techniques that would be familiar to practitioners of certain ancient traditions that combine culinary arts with forms of consciousness, manipulation. The social interactions that take place in these establishments serve not simply as normal community networking or casual socialization, but as opportunities for supernatural entities to observe and evaluate local residents while gathering information that can be used to identify individuals whose circumstances or psychological characteristics make them suitable for recruitment into more intensive forms of otherworldly service. The conversations that occur over coffee or during casual shopping expeditions are monitored and analyzed by intelligences whose understanding of human psychology exceeds anything that conventional social science has achieved. The architectural features of the downtown buildings incorporate design elements that serve purposes beyond simple aesthetic appeal or structural functionality, Their specific geometric relationships and spatial configurations, creating environments where normal psychological defense mechanisms are subtly compromised in ways that make visitors more susceptible to supernatural influences. The placement of windows, doors, and interior spaces follows principles that would be recognized by students of certain esoteric traditions as techniques for manipulating consciousness through environmental design. The community events that bring residents together for seasonal celebrations, civic meetings, and social gatherings serve not simply as opportunities for normal democratic participation or cultural expression, but as mass psychological conditioning sessions where collective consciousness can be shaped and directed through techniques that combine entertainment with sophisticated forms of complex mental manipulation. The speeches delivered at these events contain embedded suggestions and symbolic content that bypass conscious critical analysis while implanting ideas and emotional associations that influence subsequent behavior and decision-making. The emergency services that should theoretically protect local residents from natural disasters, medical crises, and criminal threats operate instead as damage control organizations whose primary function is to manage the visible consequences of supernatural incidents in ways that prevent unwanted attention from external authorities while ensuring that traumatized witnesses receive the kind of medical and psychological treatment that will discourage them from seeking further investigation or sharing their experiences with outsiders. The hospital and medical facilities that serve the Gravity Falls area employ staff members who have been specially trained to recognize and treat injuries and psychological conditions that result from exposure to supernatural forces. Their diagnostic procedures and treatment protocols, incorporating techniques that would not be found in conventional medical textbooks. The medications dispensed by local pharmacies often contain compounds that affect memory formation and emotional processing in ways that help patients integrate traumatic supernatural experiences into their psychological frameworks without suffering permanent damage to their mental stability. The educational system that serves local children operates not simply as a normal academic institution designed to prepare young people for adult responsibilities and career opportunities, but as a sophisticated screening and conditioning program that identifies students whose psychological profiles and family backgrounds make them suitable candidates for various forms of supernatural service. The curriculum incorporates subjects and teaching methods that gradually acclimate children to concepts and experiences that would be considered disturbing or inappropriate in conventional educational environments. The teachers and administrators who staff these schools have been carefully selected not only for their pedagogical qualifications but for their psychological characteristics and personal histories that make them effective agents for the Fano Baldado Bond Bend. Gradual conditioning of young minds that will eventually be called upon to serve purposes that extend far beyond normal human concerns. Their apparent dedication to their students' well-being conceals their actual function as talent scouts and psychological engineers whose work contributes to the long-term projects that define Gravity Falls' relationship with Gravity Falls' relationship with Gravity Falls' relationship with Gravity Falls' relationship otherworldly forces. In the end, the town of Gravity Falls represents not simply a community that has learned to coexist with supernatural phenomena, but a carefully constructed social experiment in which every aspect of human civilization has been modified to serve the needs and purposes of entities whose ultimate goals remain hidden from the conscious awareness of their human collaborators. The residents who call this place home are not simply people who have chosen to live in an unusual location, but are participants in a vast and ongoing project whose scope and implications extend far beyond anything that normal human consciousness is equipped to understand or effectively resist. The child who would eventually become known throughout the supernatural community as Gideon Charles Gleeful was not born into ordinary circumstances, but emerged into a world that had been carefully prepared for his arrival by forces that had been monitoring his family lineage for generations, waiting for the precise combination of genetic heritage and astrological timing that would produce a consciousness capable of serving as their perfect vessel in the three-dimensional realm. His birth during the winter solstice of 1999 was not coincidental, but represented the culmination of careful planning that stretched back through multiple generations of selective breeding and spiritual conditioning, designed to create an individual whose natural psychic abilities would make him uniquely suitable for the role he was destined to fulfill. The gleeful family name carried within its syllables a history of involvement with supernatural forces that extended far beyond the quaint tourist attraction that served as their public face. Their genealogical records, revealing connections to individuals and organizations that had played significant roles in various occult movements and esoteric societies throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The bloodline that produced Gideon had been systematically cultivated through marriages and relationships that prioritized psychic sensitivity and spiritual receptivity over conventional considerations of social compatibility or economic advantage. His mother's death during childbirth was not simply a tragic medical complication, but represented a form of supernatural sacrifice that was necessary to complete the spiritual preparations that would allow the entities who had orchestrated his birth to establish the kind of direct connection to his consciousness that their plans required. The life force that departed with her final breath did not simply dissipate, but was channeled into the newborn child, enhancing his natural psychic abilities while creating the psychological wounds and emotional vulnerabilities that would make him susceptible to influences that normal children would instinctively reject. The father who raised him, Bud Gleeful, was not simply a grieving widower doing his best to care for a son whose abilities he could not understand, but was himself a willing participant in the supernatural agenda that had brought about his wife's death and his son's exceptional gifts. The cheerful demeanor and bumbling personality that characterized his public persona concealed his actual role as a handler and facilitator whose primary responsibility was ensuring that Gideon's developing abilities were channeled in directions that served the purposes of their otherworldly patrons. The psychic powers that manifested in Gideon from his earliest childhood were not random genetic mutations or natural evolutionary developments, but were the result of deliberate intervention by entities whose understanding of consciousness and mental energy far exceeded anything that human psychology had achieved. The telekinetic abilities that allowed him to move objects with his mind, the telepathic insights that gave him access to other people's thoughts and emotions, the precognitive flashes that provided glimpses of future events. All of these capabilities had been specifically engineered to make him an effective agent for forces whose plans required human intermediaries with enhanced mental base abilities. The tent of telepathy that served as the public venue for Gideon's demonstrations was not simply a family business designed to capitalize on his unusual talents, but functioned as a recruitment center where individuals whose psychological profiles and personal circumstances made them suitable for various forms of supernatural service could be identified and evaluated. The audiences who attended his performances were not simply entertainment seekers hoping to witness genuine psychic phenomena, but were being systematically screened by entities whose ability to perceive human consciousness allowed them to recognize potential allies and agents among the crowd. The techniques that Gideon employed during his public performances were not simply applications of his natural abilities, but incorporated methods and practices that had been taught to him by intelligences whose knowledge of mental manipulation techniques exceeded anything that conventional psychology had discovered. His apparent skill at reading minds and predicting future events was enhanced by information that was provided to him through channels that existed outside normal sensory perception, allowing him to demonstrate capabilities that appeared to exceed even his genuinely impressive natural gifts. The emotional manipulation that characterized his interactions with audience members was not simply the result of childhood narcissism or natural showmanship, but represented the application of psychological techniques that had been specifically designed to create the kinds of emotional dependency and spiritual vulnerability that made individuals more susceptible to supernatural influences. The people who left his performances feeling amazed, inspired, or spiritually elevated were actually experiencing the early stages of a conditioning process that would gradually prepare them for more intensive forms of otherworldly manipulation. The obsession with Mabel Pines that would eventually lead to his apparent downfall was not based on normal childhood attraction or innocent romantic feelings, but represented the activation of programming that had been installed in his consciousness from birth, compelling him to pursue a relationship with someone whose own spiritual contamination and dimensional sensitivity made her an ideal partner for the next phase of his supernatural development. His pursuit of her affections was not motivated by personal desire, but by unconscious recognition of her suitability for the role she was intended to play in the larger cosmic drama that was unfolding around both of their families. The amulet that served as the focus for his most impressive psychic demonstrations was not simply a family heirloom or antique jewelry, but was a genuine artifact whose origins stretched back through centuries of occult practice and supernatural experimentation. The crystal that formed its centerpiece had been harvested from geological formations that existed partially outside normal three-dimensional space. Its molecular structure, incorporating elements and compounds that did not conform to conventional atomic theory or chemical classification. The power that flowed through this artifact was not generated by Gideon's own psychic abilities, but was channeled from entities whose existence spanned multiple dimensions, their consciousness operating on scales, and according to principles that made human awareness seem as limited and primitive as the sensory experience of insects attempting to comprehend the electromagnetic spectrum. The amulet served not as an amplifier for his natural talents, but as a conduit that allowed otherworldly intelligences to manifest their influence in the three-dimensional realm through his physical presence and conscious participation. The connection between this amulet and Bill's cipher was not coincidental, but represented a direct technological link between the dream demon and the child who had been prepared from birth to serve as his earthly representative. The geometric patterns etched into the crystal's surface were not decorative elements, but functional components of a communication system that allowed Bill to influence Gideon's thoughts and actions, while remaining safely concealed within his own dimensional prison. The knowledge that Gideon possessed about the journals and their contents was not acquired through independent research or accidental discovery, but was provided to him through this supernatural communication channel, giving him access to information that should have been impossible for someone of his age and educational background to understand or utilize. His apparent intelligence and strategic thinking were enhanced by insights from an entity whose understanding of human psychology and dimensional physics far exceeded anything that terrestrial science had achieved. The criminal activities that eventually led to Gideon's imprisonment were not simply the result of childhood megalomania or natural antisocial tendencies, but represented the activation of behavioral programming that had been designed to place him in situations where his abilities could be further developed and refined through exposure to the kind of stress and conflict that normal childhood experiences could not provide. His willingness to engage in fraud, manipulation, and eventually attempted murder was not evidence of innate evil, but of successful psychological conditioning that had systematically eliminated his capacity for normal moral reasoning and ethical consideration. The relationship he formed with his father throughout this period was not based on normal familial affection or parental guidance, but represented a form of professional collaboration between two agents working towards shared objectives that had been established by forces beyond their conscious understanding. Bud's apparent ignorance of his son's criminal activities was not genuine parental blindness, but deliberate strategic ignorance that allowed him to provide support and resources while maintaining plausible deniability about their ultimate purposes. The incarceration that followed Gideon's arrest was not simply punitive detention designed to protect society from a dangerous individual, but served as the next phase in his supernatural education, placing him in an environment where he could be exposed to forms of criminality and psychological manipulation that would prepare him for more sophisticated roles in the cosmic agenda that defined his destiny. The juvenile detention facility where he was held was not a conventional correctional institution, but had been specifically selected because its staff and inmate population included individuals whose own backgrounds involved various forms of occult practice and supernatural experience. The influence that Gideon wielded over fellow inmates was not based simply on his psychic abilities or natural charisma, but was enhanced by techniques that he learned from other prisoners whose own criminal careers had involved activities that extended beyond normal illegal enterprise into realms of supernatural crime and interdimensional smuggling. The education he received during his incarceration included subjects that would never appear in conventional academic curricula, preparing him for responsibilities that would eventually require him to serve as an interface between human criminal organizations and entities whose own activities operated according to principles that transcended normal, legal, and moral frameworks. The escape attempts and behavioral incidents that punctuated his time in detention were not random expressions of rebellious energy or frustrated ambition, but carefully orchestrated exercises designed to test and develop his abilities under controlled conditions while providing opportunities for him to demonstrate his readiness for the next phase of his supernatural development. The corrections officers and counselors who worked with him during this period were not simply dedicated public servants trying to rehabilitate a troubled youth, but were themselves agents of the same forces that had orchestrated his birth and guided his development from infancy. The psychological evaluations and therapeutic interventions that he underwent during his incarceration were not genuine attempts to address his behavioral problems or mental health issues, but served as additional conditioning sessions where his personality could be further modified and his loyalty to his supernatural patrons could be reinforced through techniques that combined conventional psychotherapy with forms of mental manipulation that had been developed by practitioners of certain ancient traditions that understood consciousness as something that could be systematically restructured through proper application of specific methodologies. The eventual release that returned him to Gravity Falls coincided not with successful rehabilitation or completion of his sentence, but with the activation of cosmic events that required his presence in the community where his supernatural education had begun. The timing of his return was coordinated with developments in the broader dimensional crisis that was building toward the catastrophic events of Weirdmageddon, ensuring that he would be available to fulfill his designated role when the final phase of Bill Cipher's invasion plan was implemented. The apparent reform that characterized his behavior following his release was not genuine moral development or psychological growth, but represented the activation of more sophisticated programming that allowed him to function more effectively as a covert agent while maintaining the appearance of normal social integration. His public expressions of remorse and his attempts to make amends for his previous actions were not sincere, but were carefully constructed performances designed to restore his access to community resources and social relationships that would be necessary for his future activities. The relationship he re-established with his father following his return was not based on renewed family bonds or mutual forgiveness, but represented the resumption of their professional collaboration under circumstances that required greater discretion and subtlety than their previous operations had employed. Bud's apparent joy at his son's rehabilitation was not genuine parental relief, but satisfaction that the next phase of their supernatural mission could finally begin under more favorable conditions. The knowledge that Gideon had acquired during his incarceration about the broader supernatural community and its various criminal enterprises was not simply street education picked up through association with other inmates, but represented systematic instruction in subjects that would prepare him to serve as a coordinator and facilitator for activities that required human agents with enhanced psychic abilities and detailed understanding of both conventional law enforcement methods and supernatural detection techniques. The plans that he began developing for his eventual return to prominence within Gravity Falls' supernatural hierarchy were not motivated by personal ambition or desire for revenge against those who had opposed him, but were based on detailed instructions that had been provided to him through his ongoing communication with Bill Cipher and other entities whose ultimate objectives extended far beyond the immediate goals of any individual human agent. The role that he was being prepared to fulfill in the approaching crisis was not that of a conventional criminal mastermind or supernatural terrorist, but something far more complex and strategically important, a human consciousness that had to been so thoroughly modified and conditioned that it could serve as a perfect vessel for otherworldly intelligence, while retaining enough apparent humanity to function effectively within normal social frameworks when necessary. The ultimate tragedy of Gideon Gleeful was not that he had been corrupted by exposure to supernatural influences, but that he represented the successful completion of a multi-generational project designed to create human beings who could serve as permanent bridges between three-dimensional reality and the entities that sought to extend their influence into our world through methods that required the willing participation of native consciousness. His story serves as a warning about the lengths to which cosmic intelligences will go to acquire human agents whose abilities and psychological characteristics make them suitable for roles in projects whose scope and implications extend far beyond anything that normal human understanding can adequately comprehend, and as a reminder that some forms of spiritual development are so dangerous that they transform education into a form of possession that destroys everything that makes consciousness genuinely human while preserving just enough original personality to create the illusion that free will and individual identity have somehow survived the transformation process. The child who had been born during the winter solstice of 1999 no longer existed in any meaningful sense, having been gradually replaced by something that wore his face and carried his memories but served purposes and loyalties that extended far beyond anything that genuinely human consciousness could embrace or even fully understand. The 3 leather-bound volumes that would eventually become known simply as the journals represent far more than mere documentation of supernatural phenomena or scientific research notes, compiled by an over-eager academic whose curiosity had exceeded his wisdom and caution. These texts are living entities in their own right, conscious artifacts whose very existence serves as a form of spiritual contamination that spreads through anyone who spends significant time studying their contents, transforming readers from normal human beings into carriers of cosmic infection that threatens not only their own sanity and soul, but the psychological well-being of everyone they subsequently encounter. The creation of these journals was not simply Ford's attempt to document his discoveries for the benefit of future researchers or to establish his legacy as a pioneering scientist who had pushed the boundaries of human knowledge into previously unexplored territories. The compulsion that drove him to record every detail of his supernatural encounters, to sketch every creature he observed, to meticulously catalogue every dimensional anomaly he discovered, was itself a form of possession that served purposes far beyond his conscious intentions or understanding. Each page that Ford filled with his careful observations and detailed illustrations served as a form of dimensional anchor that helped to stabilize the connection between normal three-dimensional reality and the nightmare realms from which Bill Cipher and his associated entities drew their power and influence. The act of documentation itself was not passive recording, but active participation in a process of reality modification that made supernatural phenomena more concrete, more permanent, and more capable of influencing events in the physical world. The specific materials from which the journals were constructed were not conventional paper and leather, but substances that had been harvested from sources that existed partially outside normal space-time, their molecular structure incorporating elements that did not conform to conventional atomic theory or chemical classification. The pages possessed a subtle luminescence that became more pronounced when exposed to supernatural energies, while the leather binding exhibited properties of preservation and durability that exceeded anything that normal tanning processes could achieve. The ink that Ford used for his writing and illustrations was not ordinary fountain pen fluid, but a compound that had been specially formulated through processes that combined conventional chemistry with techniques drawn from alchemical traditions that understood writing as a form of magical practice capable of influencing reality through the precise arrangement of symbolic elements. Each word that appeared on the journal pages was not simply information recorded for future reference, but a form of incantation that helped to manifest the phenomena it described in increasingly concrete and permanent forms. The symbols and cipher codes that protected the most dangerous sections of the journals were not simply academic precautions designed to prevent casual readers from accessing information that might prove harmful if misunderstood or misapplied. These cryptographic systems were themselves forms of consciousness filtering mechanisms that ensured only individuals whose psychological profiles and spiritual characteristics made them suitable for exposure to cosmic truth would be able to decode the most significant revelations contained within the texts. The process of deciphering these codes was not simply an intellectual exercise that required mathematical skill and logical reasoning, but a form of spiritual initiation that gradually modified the neural architecture of anyone who successfully completed the translation process. Each symbol that was correctly interpreted, each hidden message that was successfully decoded, each secret meaning that was finally understood, served as a step in a transformation process that slowly replaced normal human consciousness with something more suitable for direct communication with otherworldly intelligences. Fiddleford McGucket's traumatic reaction to his exposure to the journal contents was not simply the response of a brilliant but emotionally fragile individual who had witnessed phenomena that exceeded his capacity for rational processing, but represented the healthy psychological defense mechanisms of someone whose fundamental humanity had not yet been sufficiently compromised to allow him to accept cosmic truth without experiencing appropriate horror and revulsion. The visions that tormented McGucket following his brief glimpse into the portal's dimensional mechanics were not hallucinations or stress-induced psychotic episodes, but accurate perceptions of the true scope and nature of the threat that Ford's research had created. The images of multiversal destruction, cosmic horror, and reality collapse that filled his dreams and waking thoughts were not products of mental illness, but genuine precognitive insights into the consequences that would inevitably follow from continued dimensional experimentation. The memory gun that McGucket eventually developed was not simply a device designed to provide relief from traumatic experiences or unwanted recollections, but represented one of the few genuinely heroic inventions in the entire history of Gravity Falls supernatural research. His understanding that some forms of knowledge are too dangerous for human consciousness to process safely led him to create a technology that could selectively remove information that posed existential threats to psychological well-being and spiritual integrity. The Society of the Blind Eye that grew out of McGucket's personal struggle with cosmic horror was not an organization of cowards or escapists seeking to avoid uncomfortable truths about the nature of reality, but a desperate attempt to protect the broader community from exposure to information that could trigger mass psychological breakdown and social collapse. The selective amnesia that the society provided to its members was not denial but mercy, a form of mental hygiene that preserved human sanity in the face of truths that consciousness was never designed to comprehend. The gradual deterioration of McGucket's own mental state following his repeated use of the memory gun was not evidence that his invention was fundamentally flawed, or that his approach to the problem of dangerous knowledge was misguided, but demonstrated the terrible personal cost of his heroic decision to sacrifice his own psychological integrity in order to protect others from suffering similar contamination. Each use of the device to erase traumatic supernatural encounters from community members' memories also removed portions of his own consciousness, slowly reducing him from a brilliant engineer and caring friend to the broken hermit who would eventually be found living in the town dump. The journal entries that documented this process of psychological disintegration served not as objective scientific observations, but as evidence of the supernatural force's growing influence over Ford's perception and judgment. His clinical descriptions of his friend's mental deterioration revealed his complete inability to recognize that McGucket's apparent madness was actually a sane response to insane circumstances, that his creation of the memory gun represented wisdom rather than weakness, and that his eventual complete breakdown was the direct result of exposure to the same cosmic influences that were gradually corrupting Ford's own consciousness. The decision to scatter the journals across different locations and hide them from anyone who might be tempted to reunite their contents was not motivated by genuine remorse or belated recognition of the dangers his research had created, but by unconscious programming that had been installed in his consciousness by Bill Cipher as part of a long-term strategy designed to ensure that the portal project would eventually be completed regardless of Ford's momentary loss of nerve or clarity of vision. The elaborate puzzle that Ford created through the journal distribution system was not designed to prevent their eventual reunification, but to ensure that only individuals whose psychological characteristics and personal circumstances made them suitable for manipulation by cosmic forces would possess the determination and resources necessary to solve the mystery and recover the complete documentation. The challenge itself served as a form of screening process that identified potential agents and collaborators, while eliminating candidates whose spiritual resistance or moral clarity might interfere with the journal's ultimate purpose. The attraction that the journals exerted over subsequent readers was not based simply on their scientific significance or their documentation of extraordinary phenomena, but represented the activation of consciousness influencing mechanisms that had been embedded within their construction from the very beginning. The compulsive fascination that individuals like Dipper experienced when exposed to their contents was not natural curiosity but artificially induced obsession, designed to ensure that suitable candidates would be unable to abandon their investigation despite growing evidence of personal danger. The knowledge contained within the journals was not simply information about supernatural creatures and dimensional phenomena, but represented a form of cognitive virus that infected the thought processes of anyone who studied their content extensively. Each fact absorbed, each illustration studied, each theoretical framework internalized served to gradually modify the reader's neural architecture in ways that made them more suitable for direct communication with otherworldly intelligences, while simultaneously reducing their capacity for independent moral reasoning. The specific order in which information was presented within the journals was not random or based on chronological sequence of discovery, but had been carefully arranged according to principles of psychological manipulation that ensured readers would be gradually exposed to increasingly dangerous concepts in a progression that maximized their likelihood of accepting cosmic truth without triggering immediate psychological collapse or moral rejection. The illustrations and diagrams that accompanied Ford's written observations were not simply visual aids designed to clarify complex concepts or provide accurate documentation of unusual phenomena, but functioned as forms of symbolic programming that influenced consciousness through direct exposure to geometric patterns and artistic compositions that operated according to principles drawn from traditions of magical practice that understood visual imagery as a form of mental manipulation more powerful than verbal instruction. The marginalia and personal notes that filled the spaces between formal entries served not as casual commentary or supplementary observations, but as subliminal messaging systems that reinforced the journal's primary psychological influence, while providing additional channels through which otherworldly intelligences could communicate with readers whose consciousness had been sufficiently modified to receive such communications. The protective measures that Ford implemented to prevent unauthorized access to the most dangerous sections of the journals were not genuine safeguards designed to protect innocent readers from harmful information, but were psychological tests that identified individuals whose determination to access forbidden knowledge exceeded their concern for personal safety, marking them as suitable candidates for more intensive forms of supernatural manipulation and eventual recruitment as conscious agents of cosmic forces. The physical effects that prolonged exposure to the journals produced in dedicated readers were not simply symptoms of academic obsession or research-related stress, but represented the early stages of biological transformation that would eventually render normal human social relationships and conventional moral frameworks impossible to maintain. The insomnia, social isolation, and obsessive behavior patterns that characterized intensive journal study were not side effects, but intended consequences of a designed process of consciousness modification. The fourth journal, whose existence has been hinted at through various cryptic references and anomalous documentation, represents not simply additional research notes that Ford chose to conceal more thoroughly than the others, but contains information that is so fundamentally dangerous to human consciousness that its mere existence poses threats to dimensional stability and psychological well-being that exceed even those created by the first 3 volumes. This hidden journal is rumored to contain not Ford's observations of supernatural phenomena, but direct transcriptions of communications received from Bill Cipher and other entities whose thought processes operate according to principles so alien to human psychology that exposure to their actual mental content would cause immediate and permanent transformation of anyone who attempted to read or understand their messages. The text itself is written not in conventional language or cipher codes, but in symbolic systems that bypass conscious interpretation to directly modify the neural architecture of anyone who views them. The location where this fourth journal has been concealed is not simply a hidden storage area, but represents a dimensional pocket that exists partially outside normal space-time, accessible only to individuals whose consciousness has been so thoroughly corrupted by exposure to the other 3 volumes that they can perceive and navigate spaces that operate according to non-Euclidean geometric principles. The ultimate purpose served by the complete journal collection is not documentation or education, but transformation of human consciousness on a scale that would fundamentally alter the nature of terrestrial civilization, creating a population of beings who retain enough human characteristics to function within existing social frameworks while serving as permanent agents of otherworldly intelligences whose ultimate objectives remain mercifully hidden from normal human awareness. The tragic irony of the journal's existence is that they were created through the genuine desire to advance human knowledge and understanding, but their actual function is to systematically destroy everything that makes knowledge and understanding genuinely human, rather than simply sophisticated forms of cosmic possession disguised as intellectual achievement. In the end, the journals represent perhaps the most successful method ever devised for transforming education into indoctrination, research into recruitment, and curiosity into the kind of spiritual corruption that destroys souls, while leaving enough original personality intact to create the illusion that learning and growth have occurred, rather than complete replacement of human consciousness, with something alien and hostile to every value and aspiration that defines authentic human existence. As our journey through Gravity Falls' darkest truths draws to its close, we find not resolution, but the terrible certainty of repetition. The town sleeps now beneath its canopy of ancient pines, but its dreams are filled with whispers from dimensions beyond mortal understanding. Each generation believes they have solved its mysteries, only to discover they have merely become the next chapter in an endless story of cosmic horror. The children grow older, but new ones arrive each summer, drawn by forces they cannot comprehend to a place where innocence goes to die. Stanley may have his memories back, but the price of remembrance is the knowledge of what he has truly unleashed. Ford continues his research, unaware that every discovery brings reality closer to its final collapse. And somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, ancient things that should not exist continue their patient work, knowing that time is an illusion and every ending is just another beginning. Rest now, if you can, and dream of simpler places where the shadows hold nothing more terrible than the absence of light. But remember, once you have seen Gravity Falls' true face, you can never really look away.